He picks up a stranger's spear, and within 10 seconds, he sees something no blacksmith in this world has ever seen. The center of gravity has shifted by 7 centimeters. Because of this, the elderly guard's back has been aching for years, and he thinks it's his age. But the boy with the scarred face and the mark of an outcast on his arm already knows how to fix it with a few strokes of a file. But let's rewind to the morning. First comes the cold. That clammy cold that creeps into your body when it lies too long on damp earth. Then the pain strikes, everywhere. In his ribs, in the cheekbones, in the fingers of his left hand, which burn as if someone had driven a red-hot nail into them. Jeong Dohwan throws his eyes open and sees a leaky roof. Gray light seeps through the rotten boards. It smells of salt and wet wood. He struggles to sit up and nearly loses consciousness from a bloke in his ribs. This body has been beaten, hard, by someone who knew what they were doing. He raises his left hand and freezes. A brand, fresh, swollen, letters burned into the skin. He doesn't know this language, but the meaning hits him immediately. Banished. And then memory hits him with a second blow, not his own. Someone else's. It lashes out in jagged fragments. The square in front of the blacksmith's yard, hundreds of eyes. A 3-pound hammer that must be lifted 100 times in a row. The 18-year-old boy's arms give out on the 43rd lift. The hammer falls. Laughter. Then fists. An old man with a white beard hammers into the boy's face that there's no place for the likes of him in the guild. That at least his father was a real blacksmith. But the son is a disgrace to the family and a waste of coal. The boy is thrown out the gate. He crawls down the street. Someone tosses a hammer with a cracked handle after him. His father's, his only inheritance. Juan sits down. His head is spinning. His body feels foreign, too light. He looks at his hands, thin, boyish, not a single callus, 40 kilos at most. In the corner of the warehouse lies that very hammer. The handle is cracked almost in half, but the head is intact. Dohwan grabs it and automatically checks the fit. 1.5 millimeters of play. The center of gravity is shifted toward the head. A serviceable tool if he replaces the handle and wedges it in. He freezes. How does he know about the play? How does he know about the head's fit? And the memory moves again, now his own. 12 years at the arms factory in Ulsan, cold forging, tolerance control, a vernier caliper in his lab coat pocket, the evening shift, a defective batch of bolts, a crane. The mold breaks free from its mount. One last thought. The tolerance was within spec. Who secured it like that? And that's it. Dohwan sets the hammer on the floor, the head down, just as they taught him at the factory. He looks around the warehouse, a former salt works right by the water. Walls of stone and clay. The roof is full of holes, but the rafters hold. In the corner, a cold furnace filled with ash, a bucket of rusty water, sacks of salt by the wall, a workbench, or rather, what's left of it. The tabletop is dried out, but the legs are sturdy. Oak. Dohwan runs his hand over the wood, and something clicks quietly in his head, as if a switch had been flipped on a device he hadn't noticed before. The cracks cease to be mere cracks. He sees which are superficial and which go all the way through. He sees that the left edge can be saved with a bracket, but the right will have to be cut off and rebuilt. He sees that the workbench will come back to life in a day. He pulls his hand away. The clicking fades. He puts his hand back. It clicks again. Right, this is something new. Dohwan fishes a piece of charcoal out of his pocket. He sits on the floor and sketches directly on the board. A lever press, a frame, a connecting rod, guides. His hands shake from the beatings. The lines still come out straight. In 10 minutes, he realizes 3 things. First, he's been thrown into another world and into a stranger's body. Fact, panic is useless. Second, the body is weak. He won't be able to lift a 3-pound hammer now or in a year, so he won't be able to forge anything himself. Third, the locals forge by eye. No templates, no tolerances. Every blacksmith handles a piece from start to finish on his own. The Middle Ages. Dohwan looks at the drawing and, for the first time this morning, almost smiles. They don't need a strong blacksmith. They need a technician. His stomach is growling with hunger. Someone else's memory tells him the kid hasn't eaten in 2 days. He gets up and goes out. The light hits his eyes. Pyongyang turns out to be a port town. 5,000 residents, stone houses by the harbor, shacks on the outskirts, a fish market, guards at the gates. Everything is gray and dusty. He walks and looks, not at people, at things, at the fishermen's tools, at the hinges of the shops, at the wheels of the carts, at the horseshoes. And every time his gaze lingers on an object for more than 3 seconds, something clicks in his head. The hinge of the fish shop. The axle is misaligned. It will creak in a month and jam in 3. The wheel of the cart. The spokes are hammered in unevenly. The rim will warp at the first bump. A gelding's horseshoe. The nails are too long. The hoof will crack by winter. This world is full of things made incorrectly. Not because the craftsmen are stupid, but because no one showed them how to calculate tolerances. Everyone works like an artist, piece by piece, by feel. And every third product is a defect that goes unnoticed until it breaks. Dohwan reaches the gate. A guard stands there, an elderly man, about 50, with a mustache and a bad back. He isn't standing at his post. He's leaning on his spear as if it were a cane, wincing with every step. Dohwan freezes. He looks at the spear. The clink rings louder than usual. The spear is government-issued. The black anvil brand on the ferrule. The shaft is made of ash. The tip is decent, but the center of gravity is shifted a hand's width toward the blade. The guard's back aches, not from age. It aches from a poorly balanced weapon. And this is where the strangest part begins. A skinny boy with a scarred face and the mark of an outcast approaches the guard and asks to hold the spear for a minute. The guard snorts. He decides the scrawny kid certainly won't run off with a heavy government-issued spear. He hands it over. Dohwan takes it. His body groans under the weight, but his mind is clear. A click floods his consciousness. He rotates the spear. He runs it through his internal alignment. The tip, the ferrule, the shaft, the counterweight, washer, balance. Center of gravity 7 centimeters forward of the middle. That's enough to put twice the normal strain on his lower back after 12 hours of holding it. He calls the guard uncle. Says his center of gravity has shifted toward the tip, which is why his back aches by evening. He asks permission to fix it. He won't touch the shaft. He'll just shift the ferrule and slip in a washer. The guard squints. He asks how the kid knows about his back. Dohwan shrugs. I can tell by the way you stand. The guard is silent. Then he nods. Dohwan returns to the storeroom with the spear. He takes it apart, removes the ferrule, files down the socket with a file, cuts a washer from an old leather bag, puts the ferrule back on, spins it. The center of gravity shifts 4 centimeters toward the handle. Not perfect, but it'll do. He carries the spear back. The guard intercepts him as usual and freezes. 1 step, 2. He slowly twists the shaft as if he doesn't trust his fingers. Then he straightens up. For the first time in a very long time, his face changes. Not joy, confusion. This is what a man looks like who has lived with a dull ache for years and suddenly realized that the pain is gone. What have you done? Dohwan explains about the center of gravity in the washer. The guard doesn't understand half the words, but his back doesn't ache anymore. That he understands. He reaches into his wallet and places a copper coin in the boy's hand. He thinks. He adds a piece of bread wrapped in a rag. His lunch. Dohwan bows. He leaves. He sits on the threshold and eats. Slowly, so he doesn't get sick on an empty stomach. 1 copper coin and a piece of bread. His first earnings in this new world. And the next morning, 6 guards are standing by the warehouse. Each has brought his own spear. Each has brought a copper coin. and 2 have brought bread. Dohwan looks at the line by the rotten shed. 6 spears, all with the same manufacturing defect, 6 aching lower backs. He takes the first one and sits down. The work takes up the whole day. Remove the burrs, sharpen, washer, fit, balance. And every time he catches himself doing it inefficiently. At the factory in Ulsan, they would have fired him for organizing his workspace like this. He needs an assembly line. First, remove all the burrs, then grind everything down, then all the washers, then assembly. But for an assembly line, he needs an assistant, and he doesn't even have a workbench. In the evening, he counts his earnings. 6 copper coins, 2 loaves of bread, a piece of cheese. You can live on that, but you can't build a workshop. He collapses onto the sacks of salt and stares at the leaky roof. Seagulls are squawking in the harbor. It smells of the sea and rust. And he starts counting. If 6 guards make up the entire guard, then the market for spears is exhausted. But there's a border garrison in Pyongyang. That's at least 50 more spears, and crossbows, and swords, and knives, and fishing gear, and nooses, and wasps, and horseshoes. There's enough work in this city to last 10 years. The only things missing are hands, and a forge, and tools, and money for all of this. And the right to a brand, which the outcast doesn't have and never will. Dohwan looks at the brand, an outcast, without the right to practice a trade, without the right to sell weapons, without the right to a brand. But today he repaired spears, 6 of them, and not a single guard asked about the brand. Because he wasn't selling weapons, he provided a service, repair, adjustment. That's not manufacturing, that's service. And there's not a word about service in the guild's charter. Dohwan almost smiles for the 2nd time that day. Every system has a loophole. You just have to read the documentation. 3 days later, Dohwan had no more guards left. All 9 copies of the city guard had passed through his hands. 4 more arrived from the border garrison. That made 13 copper coins and a 2-day supply of bread. It was enough to keep him from dying, but the warehouse roof was still leaking, and the furnace stood clogged with ash and cold as a grave. Dohwan spent the entire 4th day cleaning the furnace. He cleared out the ash. He caulked the cracks with clay from the shore. He checked the draft. The forge worked. Poorly. It smoked, but it worked. On the 5th day, he went to the fish market and started looking at knives. Not to buy, just to look. The fishermen in Pyongyang cut fish with knives stamped with the black anvil mark. Heavy, thick, with a straight blade. All-purpose, which meant equally awkward for any task. Dohwan approached a fisherman who was gutting a flounder. The old man cursed the knife every 30 seconds. The blade kept slipping off the flat fish. The handle was too thick for wet hands. Dohwan sat down nearby. He asked if he could take a look at the knife. The old man handed it over silently. Dohwan took the knife and ran it through the ideal assembly. The steel is decent. The tempering is uneven. The left edge of the blade is softer than the right. The sharpening angle is 30 degrees. For fish, it needs to be 20. The handle is round. For wet work, you need an oval one with notches. And most importantly, a straight blade on flat fish is torture. You need a curve. Dohwan returned the knife and asked how much the guard was willing to pay for a knife that wouldn't slip off a flounder. The fisherman looked at him as if he were crazy and said that only the guild makes knives. Dohwan nodded and said he wasn't going to make a knife. He was going to regrind the old one, change the angle, finish the handle. This is a repair, not manufacturing. The fisherman thought for a moment and said 2 copper coins. Dohwan took the knife and went to his workshop. The regrinding took 3 hours. He only needed the horn to slightly temper the steel at the edge. Then, he ground the blade to the right curve on an old whetstone. He wrapped the handle with a strip of notched leather. He returned the knife to the fisherman that evening. The old man took it. He ran it along a flounder. The blade went in like butter. The fisherman silently placed 3 copper coins on the counter instead of 2, and told Dohwan to come back tomorrow. He had 4 more who wanted the same sharpening. Dohwan walked back to the workshop and thought. The guards had brought in 13 copper coins in a week. The fisherman would bring in 20 in 3 days. Fishermen are the best market, but the workload is growing. Each knife takes 3 hours of manual labor. 5 knives a day is the limit for one person. And that's if you don't eat or sleep. He needs an assistant. On the 6th day, a woman entered the warehouse. Tall, lean, in a traveling cloak with a dusty hem. A sharp face, calculating eyes. She surveyed the warehouse with a single glance, and Dohwan noticed how she mentally assessed the room's size and the condition of the walls. She introduced herself as So Rin. She asked if it was true that a master who repaired weapons better than the Black Anvil worked here. Dohwan replied that he wasn't a master, that he simply adjusted the balance and resharpened blades. So Rin nodded and said she didn't care what it was called. She needed someone who could supply goods bypassing the guild. Dohwan raised his hand and showed her the brand. He said he was forbidden from selling weapons. So Rin sat down on a sack of salt across from him and said that was exactly why she was there. She explained the situation. So Rin was the daughter of the So trading house. 3 years ago, the Merchants Guild had absorbed her father's business. Formally, bankruptcy. In reality, her father had been forced out because he'd started trading directly with the southern barons, bypassing the guild's warehouses. So Rin was left with the right to engage in small-scale retail trade. Small-scale meant no more than 50 copper coins per transaction. That was enough for trading fish and vegetables, but not weapons. However, if the goods aren't weapons but repair services, if the buyer isn't paying for a sword but for balancing and sharpening, then technically it isn't large-scale arms dealing. It's a service. So Rin pulled a rolled-up sheet of paper from her bosom. She unrolled it. It was a draft contract, written in small handwriting, with 10 safeguard clauses, with provisions in case of confiscation, with a clause on loss sharing. Juan read the contract and felt something between respect and wariness. This woman hadn't come to him on a whim. She had calculated everything in advance. He asked why she needed 10 safeguard clauses if she trusted him. So Ren looked him in the eye and replied that she didn't trust him, that she hadn't trusted anyone since the guild had taken everything from her family, that a contract wasn't about trust. A contract was about conditions under which trust wasn't required. Dohwan nodded. He understood that logic. At the factory in Ulsan, contracts with suppliers worked exactly the same way. He signed, with a piece of charcoal on damp paper. So Rin tucked the contract away. She stood up and said she already had her first order, a fishing cooperative at the South Pier. 12 knives, resharpening and handle replacement. 2-week deadline. 31. 10 for her as a middleman, 20 for him. Dohwan did the math in his head. 12 knives in 2 weeks. Doable, but tight, if he worked alone. So Rin was already at the door when he called out to her. He asked if she knew anyone looking for work, someone with strong hands and no particular prospects. So Rin turned around and replied that in Pyongyang, half the city was like that. On the 8th day, So Rin brought 2 guys, brothers, fishermen's sons. Strong, dumb as rocks when it came to reading and writing, but their hands were golden. Dohwan sat them down at the workbench and explained the sharpening process in an hour. He broke it down into 3 steps. First, remove the old handle wrap. Second, clamp the knife in a vise and grind the edge to the right angle. Third, wind on the new handle. He demonstrated each step once, slowly, with an explanation. One of the brothers got it on the 2nd try. The other had to go through it 4 times. But by evening, both were working. Crooked, slowly, but they were working. Dohwan walked between them and corrected them. Here the angle is too sharp. Here the wrapping is loose. Here the pressure is too strong. He didn't do the work for them. He showed them how to do it right. The quiet memory of the hands, one facet of his ability. Once he saw an operation, he could explain it to another person so that they could repeat it. He himself grew tired after an hour of working with a hammer. His hands trembled. His body wouldn't cooperate. But as a mentor, he was flawless. By the end of the 9th day, the brothers had sharpened 4 of the 12 knives. The quality was passable. Not perfect, but passable. Dohwan checked each one. 2 had to be fixed. 2 passed. That was the first moment he realized the system worked. Not him alone, the system. The division of labor. One prepares the blank, another sharpens, a third checks. That evening, he sat down by the forge and began sketching on a board. Not a knife, not a spear, a workflow diagram. Who does what, in what order, how much time per operation, where the bottleneck is. Sodin came in to check on him and found him working on this drawing. She looked at it for a long time. Then she asked what it was. Dohwan said it was a process flowchart. Sodin asked why. Dohwan explained that if he were to come down with a fever tomorrow, his brothers would have to continue the work without him. And for that, they need instructions. Not verbal, written, with pictures, so that any fool could figure it out. Sodin was silent for a minute. Then she said she'd never heard of a craftsman writing down his techniques, that usually masters keep their secrets and pass them on only to their sons. Dohwan, without looking up from the drawing, replied that secrets were a luxury for those who had sons, and he had only a leaky roof and 12 knives that had to be delivered in 10 days. The 12 knives were ready on the 11th day, 3 days ahead of schedule. Dohwan checked each one personally. He ran them through the perfect assembly. 9 passed, 3 had to be fixed. The final quality was higher than that of the black anvil knives. Not by much, but higher. So Rin picked up the batch and took it to the fishing cooperative. She returned in the evening with 20 copper coins and some news. The cooperative wants 20 more knives, and one of the fishermen mentioned the sharpening to an acquaintance from the border garrison. The garrison sergeant asked if the craftsman from the warehouse could take a look at their crossbows. Half of their crossbows can't hit a target more than 30 paces away. Juan took the copper coins. He put them in a tin can under the workbench. He counted the total cash. 46 copper coins. That would buy a slightly better used bellows, or a sack of coal, or fix the roof. But not all at once. He chose the coal. Without good coal, the bellows are useless. The roof can wait. On the 13th day, Dohwan picked up a crossbow for the first time. The garrison sergeant. Heavy, clumsy, with the black anvil's mark on the stock. Dohwan placed it on the workbench and initiated the perfect assembly. The clicking in his head grew so loud that he closed his eyes for a second. The crossbow broke down in his mind into 43 parts. Stock, bow, string, trigger mechanism, guide, bolts. He saw it all. The bow was overheated. Micro cracks on the inside. It'll snap after 200 shots. The string is tensioned unevenly. The left edge is 0.5 millimeter weaker. That's why the bolt drifts to the right. The guide. That's where the main problem lies. The bolt groove was made by eye. It wasn't calibrated. The bolt wobbles in the groove and veers off in a random direction with every shot. Dohwan looked up at the sergeant. He said the crossbow wasn't broken. It was poorly made from the start. The sergeant frowned and asked if the master could fix it. Dohwan paused. Fixing a crossbow isn't like sharpening a knife. It's serious work. The bow needs to be retempered. The string needs to be straightened. The guide needs to be bored out to fit the bolt's caliber. For that, you need a proper brazier, proper tools, and time. He replied that he could, but not for a copper coin. The sergeant asked how much. Dohwan named his price, 5 copper coins for the crossbow. The sergeant whistled. Then he did some quick math in his head. He had 32 crossbows in the garrison, and they were all shooting all over the place. New ones at Black Anvil cost a silver coin apiece. 5 copper coins for a repair is 20 times cheaper than a new one. The sergeant agreed, but he said he wanted to see the results on one first. Dohwan nodded. That was fair. He worked on the crossbow for 2 days. He heated the bow in the forge, let it cool, tempered it again. More slowly, more evenly. He filed down the guide with a file, calibrated it to the bolt, checked the clearance with a thin wire probe, straightened the bowstring, assembled it, checked the trigger. Smooth. On the morning of the third day, they went outside the city wall. The sergeant set up a target 50 paces away. Dohwan loaded the crossbow and handed it to the sergeant. The first bolt hit the center of the target. The sergeant silently loaded the second, also in the center. The third, close. The fourth, close. The fifth. The sergeant lowered the crossbow and stared at the target for a long time. Then he turned to Dohwan and said he would bring the remaining 31 tomorrow. Dohwan returned to the warehouse and sat down on the floor. 31 crossbows at 5 copper coins each. 155 copper coins. That's more than enough for a silver one. With that money, he could repair the roof, buy a decent vise, hire 2 more assistants. He looked at his hands, thin, with calluses that had formed over the past 2 weeks, hands that couldn't lift a 3-pound hammer but could calibrate a crossbow to factory precision. In this world where brute force decided everything, he had found a place for precision. Now he had to hold on to that place. 32 crossbows stood against the warehouse wall in a row like soldiers at attention. Dohwan looked at them and counted. 2 days per crossbow if working alone. 32 crossbows meant 64 days, more than 2 months. The sergeant wouldn't wait that long. He'd have to work on them in parallel. Dohwan broke down the crossbow repair into 6 steps. First, disassembly. Second, tempering and annealing the bow. Third, boring the guide. Fourth, replacing the bowstring. Fifth, assembly. Sixth, calibration and firing test. The first, second, fourth, and fifth steps could be done by the brothers after training. Only he could handle the third and sixth. Boring required perfect assembly. Calibration did too. He spent 2 days training his brothers. He taught them disassembly in an hour, assembly in 3. Retempering the bow took some work. The older brother overheated the first bow. Hwan didn't yell. He explained it again. He showed them the color of the metal at the right temperature. Cherry, not orange, not red. Cherry. The older brother nodded. He got the second bow right. On the third day, the line was up and running. The brothers were disassembling the crossbows. The older brother overheated the bows. The younger brother replaced the strings. Dohwan bored out the guides and calibrated them. So Rin came in the evenings to count the finished units and take away the report. By the end of the second week, 14 crossbows were ready. The pace picked up. The brothers got the hang of it and worked faster. Dohwan found his rhythm. Boring in the morning, calibrating in the afternoon, checking others' work in the evening, drawing blueprints at night. He slept 5 hours a night, which wasn't enough, but his body held up. 18 years old, young, hungry, but resilient. On the 17th day of work, Yoon Ata entered the warehouse. Dohwan noticed her right away. He was sitting over the guide rail of the 15th crossbow, measuring the clearance. Ata stood by the door and watched. Short, lean, short hair tied back with a cloth ribbon, a sword in a worn scabbard at her belt. Her eyes were hard, her mouth tight. Dohwan looked up and asked what she wanted. Ata said so Rin had sent her, to guard the warehouse, because rumors about the workshop had already spread throughout the city, and someone might get the idea that there was something here to profit from. Dohwan looked at her, at the sword, at her hands. Her hands were covered in small scars. Her knuckles were calloused. Not a decorative fighter, a worker. He asked how much she charged. Ata named her price, 2 copper coins a day. Dohwan nodded. It was expensive for his budget, but cheaper than losing 32 crossbows. Ata took up a position by the door, and for the next 3 days was just a shadow. Silent, attentive. She ate her rations. She slept on sacks by the entrance. Dohwan had almost forgotten about her until, on the 20th day, she walked up to the workbench and placed her sword in front of him. Dohwan looked up. Ata stood with the expression of someone who had made up her mind after much hesitation. She said the sword veered to the side, that she'd gotten used to it over 3 years and compensated with a flick of her wrist. But it cost her precious moments, and she asked if he could take a look. Dohwan set down the crossbow. He picked up the sword. Heavy. A good blade, but a click in his head. Balance. The center of gravity was 2 fingers ahead of the optimal point for a one-handed grip. For a man with long arms and broad shoulders, that's normal. For Ada, with her height and grip, it meant the sword veered to the right with every strike. The sword wasn't made for her. The sword was made for an average man, because all the swords from the Black Anvil were made for an average man. Dohwan twirled the blade in his hands. Then he looked at Ada. He asked her to take a stance and hold the sword as usual. Ada took it. Dohwan circled around her. He looked at her grip, at her shoulder, at her elbow, at the angle of her wrist. He saw everything. Her grip was narrow. Her fingers were short. Her wrist was flexible. Her shoulder was strong but not broad. She needed a blade a palm's length shorter, a hilt a finger's width thinner, and the center of gravity half a finger's width closer to her hand. Dohwan said he needed 3 knights. Ara asked, 3 knights for what? Dohwan replied that he was going to rebalance her sword, remove excess metal from the blade, resize the hilt, shift the center of gravity. It would be the same sword, but tailored to her height, to her grip, to her shoulder. Ara was silent. Then she asked why he was doing this. Dohwan shrugged and said that she was guarding his workshop. If her sword veered off course, his workshop was less protected than it could be. This wasn't a gift, it was an investment in safety. Ara snorted, but she left the sword behind. Dohwan worked on it for 3 nights. It was a different kind of work, not assembly line, not mass-produced, a one-off. He removed a strip of metal from the blade's butt, a thin one, just enough to shift the balance. He reground it. He took the hilt apart completely. He rewrapped it, thinner, with notches for her fingers. He lightened the pommel. He made the pommel cap slightly heavier, a counterweight. On the 3rd night, he finished. He checked it using the ideal assembly. The center of gravity fell exactly where it needed to, half a finger's width closer to the hilt. In the morning, he placed the sword before Ara. She took it, gripped it, as usual, and froze. Dohwan saw how her eyes changed. She made a test strike. Slowly, the blade moved smoothly, without wavering. She made a second, faster, a third, at full speed, a fourth, a fifth, a series of 8 strikes. Each went exactly where she aimed, without any wrist compensation. For the first time in 3 years, Ara lowered the sword. She stood with her back to him, silently, for a long time. Then she said quietly that this wasn't a woman's sword. Her voice sounded strange. Dohwan replied that it wasn't a woman's sword. It was her sword. There were no others like it. Ara didn't turn around. She stood there for another minute, and Dohwan saw her shoulders tremble once. Then she sheathed the sword and went back to her post by the door. They didn't speak of it again, but from that day on, Ara ceased to be merely a guard. She began bringing things to the workbench, a broken belt buckle, a comrade's dulled knife, a shield with a loose bracket. Each time, she would silently place it on the workbench and say a single word. Look. Dohwan would look. He would repair it, or explain why it couldn't be fixed and needed to be replaced. Ara listened. She memorized. Sometimes she asked questions, short ones, to the point. She wasn't an engineer, but she was a warrior who was used to taking enemies apart. Only now she was taking apart mechanisms instead of enemies. By the end of the month, all 32 crossbows were ready. The sergeant arrived with a cart and 3 soldiers. They loaded them up. They counted them. The sergeant counted out 155 copper coins, a silver coin, and some change. Then he pulled a letter from his bosom. He said it was from the border baron. The baron had heard about the workshop. He wanted to meet. Dohwan took the letter. He unfolded it. The handwriting was crisp, military. Baron Yoon Sang-ho, commander of the southern border garrison. He invites the master from Pyongyang to dinner to discuss a possible supply contract. Dohwan looked at So-rin. She was already reading over his shoulder. Her eyes were shining. A baron isn't a guard or a fisherman. A baron means a government contract, real money, real volume, and real problems. Because a government contract means Black Anvil territory, and they won't give it up without a fight. Dohwan rolled up the letter, put it in his pocket, looked at his warehouse, a leaky roof, 1 forger, 2 apprentices, 1 security guard, 1 merchant's wife, and himself, a scrawny boy with the mark of an outcast on his arm. They were going to have dinner with the Baron. He told So-rin they needed decent clothes. So-rin replied that clothes were the last thing they should be worrying about. The first thing was what they could offer the Baron that the Black Anvil couldn't. Dohwan thought for a second and answered with a single word: quality. Dinner at Baron Yoon Sang-ho's took place 4 days later. Dohwan spent 2 of those days preparing, not clothes, samples. He took the best of what he had: a reforged fishing knife, a calibrated crossbow, and a spear. Uncle Park's spear. The very one. The first one. Park lent it to him for the evening without asking any questions. Dohwan packed everything into a burlap sack and rode in So-rin's cart. Ada sat beside him. Her personal sword hung at her waist. She didn't ask why they were going. Dohwan didn't explain. The Baron's castle stood 3 hours' ride from Pyonghan, on a hill above the river. Small, stone, a garrison all around. 600 soldiers, tents, stables, a palisade. It smelled of horses and leather. The Baron was waiting for them in the hall. A large table. Simple food. Meat. Bread. Beer. No gold, no silk. A military man at a military post. Yoon Sang-ho turned out to be a large man of about 45 with a weather-beaten face and a broken nose. He stood up when they entered. He looked at Dohwan. Dohwan could see the Baron mentally counting his ribs through his shirt. The Baron said he had expected someone larger. Dohwan replied that he often heard that. They sat down. Dohwan did not eat right away. He took out the samples and laid them out on the table. A knife, a crossbow, a spear. The Baron reached for the crossbow first. He turned it over in his hands. He frowned. It was a government-issued crossbow. He recognized the anvil mark. He asked what was wrong with it. Dohwan said that was just how it was now. He asked him to load it and fire. At the wall, if the Baron didn't mind. The Baron smirked. He loaded it. He aimed at a wooden shield on the wall. The bolt hit right in the center. The Baron looked at the crossbow. He looked at Dohwan. He reloaded. The second bolt landed next to the first. The third, right next to it. The Baron set down the crossbow and said that his crossbows didn't shoot like that. Dohwan replied that now 32 of them shot exactly like that. The Baron was silent. Then he asked the main question: how much? For a new shipment, how much and what? Dohwan was ready. He had spent the entire previous evening with So-rin poring over the numbers. So-rin had been counting the money. Dohwan calculated the labor costs. They argued for 3 hours and arrived at a price that was half that of Black Anvil for comparable quality. Dohwan named the figures: 100 copies, 30 crossbows, 3-month delivery, price. He named it. The Baron raised his eyebrows. Then he called his accountant. They calculated together. So-rin sat nearby and silently watched the numbers. 10 minutes later, the Baron said the price was good. Too good. He asked what the catch was. Dohwan replied that there was no catch, that he worked cheaper because he worked more efficiently. Division of labor, standardization, quality control. The Baron didn't understand a single one of those words, but he liked the way they sounded. He asked one more question, the main one. The boy has no guild mark. How will he sell weapons without the guild's mark? Dohwan looked at So-rin. She sat up straight and spoke. Her voice was businesslike, clear. She explained that, formally, the workshop doesn't sell weapons. The workshop provides a service for assembling and fine-tuning weapons using the customer's materials. The Baron buys the metal himself. The Baron brings it to the workshop. The workshop processes it and returns the finished product. This is a contract for work, not the sale of weapons. The guild charter does not regulate such contracts. The Baron listened. Then he laughed. He said that Miss So knew the law well. So-rin replied that when the law takes everything from you, whether you like it or not, you learn it by heart. The Baron stopped laughing. He looked at her seriously. Then he nodded. The contract was signed that very evening, in So-rin's name, just like the first time. Dohwan didn't sign his name, only a technical visa, master consultant, without a brand, but with the right to work on contract. So Rin signed with a steady hand. Dohwan saw how she held her breath for a second before affixing the seal. The first major contract in her name. Not a government job, her own. On the way back in the cart, they were silent. Ara was dozing, leaning against the side. So Rin sat upright, holding the contract on her lap. Dohwan was doing the math in his head. 100 copies in 3 months. That's 33 spears a month, just over 1 a day. That would require at least 5 workers. He had 2. 30 crossbows in 3 months, 10 a month. It was feasible, but only if he handled the calibration himself. And he needed iron, a lot of it. The Baron had promised to supply it, but the iron still needed to be inspected. If the iron is bad, all the work goes to waste. Dohwan got home after midnight. He lay down on the sacks. He didn't sleep. He was calculating. The first shipment of iron arrived a week later. 2 carts, 40 ingots. Dohwan stood at the warehouse gate and picked up every ingot. The smell of metal. Another facet of his ability. He picked up an ingot and knew. This one is good. Low sulfur, good for spearheads. This one is dirty. Too much phosphorus. Maybe for nails, not for spears. This one's overcooked, fragile. Back to the smelter. Out of 40 ingots, he sorted 28 suitable for spears and crossbow limbs. He rejected 12. So Rin stood nearby and took notes. Then she looked at the pile of rejects and said that was a 30% loss. The Baron won't like it. Dohwan said the Baron would like the spears that break on the 3rd strike even less. The rejects were sent back with an explanatory note. The Baron sent a reply 2 days later. It was brief. He was dissatisfied, but he sent 12 new ingots in exchange. Dohwan inspected them. 10 were usable. 2 were rejects again. Better than the first time. Now they needed workers. So Rin found 3. 2 were former apprentices from village smithies. They hadn't passed the trial of the body. The mark of outcasts on their hands, just like Dohwan's. The 3rd was a former carpenter who'd lost his workshop in a fire. Strong hands, a sharp mind, hungry eyes. Dohwan sat all 5 of them down at the workbench. 2 brothers and 3 newcomers. He sketched a diagram of spear production on the board. 7 steps. Forging the tip, hardening, polishing, shaping the shaft, attaching the head, balancing, inspection. He assigned a step to each man. He trained each one individually. He demonstrated it once. Then, he watched the worker perform the task. He corrected him. He demonstrated it again. By the end of the first day, each of the 5 knew his step. Not perfectly, but they knew it. On the 2nd day, we started the production line. The first spear came out crooked. The tip was set at an angle. Dohwan didn't yell. He took it apart. He showed where the mistake was. We put it back together. The 2nd spear came out better. The 3rd was even better. By the evening of the 2nd day, they had produced 4 spears. 1 was a reject. 3 were usable. Dohwan checked each one using the perfect assembly method. 2 passed immediately. 1 had to be adjusted for balance, but all 3 were better than the standard spears from the Black Anvil. Dohwan knew this for sure. He held Pak's government-issued spear in one hand and his own in the other, and the difference was like that between a handmade item and a factory-made one. That night, he sat down to draw a blueprint, not of the spears, of the process, where the bottleneck was, the forging. 1 forge, not enough capacity for more than 6 spearheads a day. A 2nd forge is needed. A 2nd forge requires money. There is no money yet. The advance from the Baron was 20%. 30 silver coins. That would be enough for a forge and coal, but it wouldn't be enough to pay the workers' wages for 3 months. So Rin sat across from him and did the math. She came up with the same figure. She said that if they didn't find a side income, they'd run out of money for wages by the middle of the term. The workers would leave. The order would fall through. Dohwan rubbed his eyes. He was tired. An 18-year-old body is resilient, but he'd been pushing it to the limit for 2 months already. He asked So Rin what she suggested. So Rin said there was an option. The city market. Small repair jobs. Knives. Hinges. Staples. A daily flow. Small change, but steady. Dohwan nodded. It made sense. The main line for the Baron's order, the sideline for city repairs. 2 streams, 2 cash registers. It was a smart move. He looked at So-rin and said that the first contract for the city market would be in her name too. So-rin was silent for a moment. Then she said he was strange, that any other craftsman in his place would grab every piece of paper and put his name on everything. But he was giving her the signing authority as if it were worth nothing. Dohwan replied that a signature was worth exactly as much as the work behind it, and he knew how to do the work, and she knew how to sell it. Why would he need her work if she did it better? So-rin looked at him for a long time. Then she rolled up the papers and left. At the door, she turned around and said quietly that this was the first time anyone had told her she did her job better. Dohwan didn't answer. He was already sketching the design for the second horn. In the 6th week, Han Mei arrived at the warehouse. At that moment, Dohwan was checking the 12th batch of tips and didn't immediately notice the slender figure by the door. She stood quietly, as if deciding whether to leave or stay. She was short. Her hair was pulled back into a careless bun. Her hands were stained with something brown. Her eyes were unfocused yet attentive, a strange combination. It was as if she were looking at the world through something only she could see. A bundle of dried roots stuck out of the pocket of her crumpled apron. Ara had noticed her first and stood in the doorway. She asked who she was and what she wanted. Han Mei said she had come to see the master, that she had a proposal. Ara looked at Dohwan. He nodded. Ara let her in. Han Mei walked over to the workbench. She pulled a small clay bottle from her bosom. She set it down in front of Dohwan. She said it was tempering oil, her recipe. She asked him to try it. Dohwan opened the bottle. He sniffed it. Thick, dark. It smelled of something bitter and something floral. Not just oil. Oil with additives. Botanical, alchemical. He didn't know the composition, but 12 years at the factory had taught him to determine the quality of a quenching medium by indirect signs. The viscosity was right. Judging by the smell, the boiling point was higher than that of a standard one. That meant the hardening would be slower, more even, less deformation, less internal stress. He asked Han Mei what was in it. She hesitated. Then she said the base was linseed oil. The additive was an extract from the ash tree root. The proportions? She fell silent. Dohwan understood. The proportions were her main secret. The only thing that made her valuable in a market where she had no license, no workshop, and no right to sell alchemical compounds. He didn't ask any further. He said he wanted to test it. He asked her to wait. He took a tip from the last batch. He heated it in the furnace until it reached the right color. He dipped it into Han Mei's oil. The oil sizzled quietly. It didn't spatter. It didn't smoke black. A good sign. He pulled the tip out after the allotted time. He let it cool. He picked it up. The smell of metal. A click in his head. The steel had settled evenly. The grain was fine. Uniform. No overheated areas. He took a second tip from the same batch. He quenched it in the usual oil from the barrel they'd been using until now. He pulled it out. He compared them. The difference was like that between factory-made and handmade. The tip quenched in Han Mei's oil was harder, more uniform, and it felt 20% stronger. Dohwan placed both tips on the workbench. He looked at Han Mei. She stood there, waiting. Her fingers fiddled with the dried root in her pocket. He asked how much she could produce in a week. Han Mei said 2 liters if she had the raw materials. 2 liters would be enough for 40 hardenings. That was enough for current volumes. Dohwan nodded. Then he said something that made Han Mei freeze. He said he wanted to place an order, officially, with a contract, with payment in advance, in her name. Han Mei blinked. She asked what he meant. Dohwan explained. He would buy hardening oil from her at a fixed price, regularly, with a monthly contract. Her name would be on the contract, as a supplier, not as a contractor, not as an apprentice, as a master alchemist. Han Mei stood in silence, for a long time. Then she said quietly that her name had never been on a contract, that she had been denied an alchemist license when she was 16, because of her blood. Mother from the south, father an outsider. Impure, half master, half everything. For 12 years, she brewed potions and oils in the basement and sold them under the table. And not once in 12 years did a single customer ask for her name. Until Juan said he needed her oil. Not someone else's, hers, made to her recipe. And he would pay a fair price for it. And her name would be on the paper, because the formula was hers. So Rin drew up the contract that very evening. Han Mei signed it. Her hand was shaking. An ink stain remained on the paper next to her signature, so Rin didn't bother to cover it up. She left it as it was. The next day, Han Mei came back, with 2 liters of oil and a notebook full of notes, formulas, temperatures, proportions. She placed the notebook on the workbench and said that if the master wanted better oil, she needed to know what it was for. 1 recipe for armor, another for crossbow limbs, a third for blades. The hardening temperatures were different, so the oil had to be different. Dohwan looked at the notebook. He looked at Han Mei. For the first time, she didn't avert her eyes. She was talking about her work, and there was the same note in her voice that Dohwan had heard in his own when he explained tolerances. Precision, enthusiasm, the quiet pride of a master who knows her craft. He sat down next to her, and they talked for 4 hours. She explained the chemistry of oils. He explained metallurgy. She didn't know the words he used. He didn't know the terms she used, but they both knew what the right temperature and the right holding time were, and that was enough to find common ground. By evening, they had a plan for 3 types of quenching oil, for pommels, for arcs, for blades. Han Mei left with eyes ablaze. Dohwan stayed behind, poring over his notes, thinking that he now had an alchemist. The workshop was growing. By the 7th week, 8 people were working there. 2 brothers at the forge, 3 new hires on polishing and assembly, Han Mei handling oil supplies, Ara on security. So Rin handled paperwork and sales, and Dohwan, who didn't forge, didn't polish, didn't assemble. He drew, he checked, he explained, he corrected, he calibrated, and he counted. Every evening he sat by the furnace and counted. How many copies were made that day? How many were defective? Where time was wasted? Why the tips in the 3rd batch came out a little softer? Because his older brother overheated the furnace for half an hour. Not on purpose, he just didn't keep track. Dohwan wrote him instructions, with a diagram, with a color-coded heating scale. He nailed it to the wall above the furnace. Defects in the 4th batch dropped by half. In the 8th week, what Dohwan had been waiting for and fearing happened. So Rin came in the morning with bad news. A man from the capital had arrived in Pyongyang, an inspector for the Black Anvil's hallmarks. His name is Gi-Wan-Su. He checked into the city inn and began making the rounds of the craft workshops. Dohwan listened and nodded. He knew this would happen, sooner or later. Rumors of a workshop that made weapons better than the guilds were bound to reach the capital. 2 months was even longer than he had expected. Inspector Gi arrived on the 3rd day, short, stocky, with oily eyes and a folder of documents under his arm. 2 men in guild guard uniforms followed him. Dohwan met him at the entrance. The inspector introduced himself. He said he had come in response to a complaint regarding the illegal production of weapons by someone without a mark or a license. He demanded to inspect the workshop and all the items. Dohwan led him inside. The inspector walked around the warehouse. He looked. He handled them. He counted them. He made notes in a folder. Then he stopped in front of the rack with the finished spears, 28 of them. A batch for the Baron. The inspector picked up 1 spear. He turned it over. He frowned. The quality was evident to the naked eye. A smooth tip, a clean finish, a perfect fit on the shaft. The inspector asked who had made it. Dohwan replied that it was a repair job using materials provided by the customer. The inspector grimaced. He said this wasn't a repair, it was a new product, and that any item without the guild's hallmark was subject to confiscation. Dohwan nodded. He had expected exactly this. He pulled a folder from behind the workbench, the contract with the Baron, the delivery notes for the iron, the material acceptance report, the work specifications. Everything was signed by the Baron personally. He placed them in front of the inspector. He explained calmly. The workshop does not manufacture weapons. The workshop performs a contract to process materials belonging to the customer. The iron belongs to the Baron. The coal belongs to the baron. The workshop sells only labor. And no hallmark is required for the sale of labor. Guild Charter, paragraph 47, subparagraph 3. The right to contract for unmarked craftsmen. The inspector read the documents. His face flushed. He knew this paragraph, and he knew that, formally, Dohwan was right. A contract for work is not the trade of weapons. The baron is the client. The baron owns the materials. The workshop is the contractor. A brand is not required. The inspector slammed the folder shut. He looked at the spears. He looked at Dohwan. He said that this wouldn't last long, that the guild would find a way to shut this operation down, that boys with a piece of coal instead of a brand don't last long in this trade. Dohwan replied that he would be glad when the guild found a way, because that would mean the guild had finally read its own charter. The inspector turned and left. The guild guards followed after him. The warehouse remained where it was. The spears remained where they were. Dohwan sat down on the workbench and exhaled. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, from the adrenaline wearing off. Ara stood by the wall with her hand on her sword, watching his back. So Rin sat in the corner, white as a sheet, but with her back perfectly straight. Han Mei never came out of the back room where she was boiling oil. She would later say she simply hadn't noticed the inspector. Dohwan wouldn't believe her. That evening, everyone gathered in the warehouse, together for the first time. The workers, the brothers, Ara, So Rin, Han Mei, Dohwan. He stood at the workbench and spoke. He said the inspector had left but would return, or they'd send another one, that the guild wouldn't back down, that things would get harder from here on out, that if anyone wanted to leave, now was the time. No hard feelings, no fines. He'd pay back everything he owed. Silence. Then the older brothers said that here they paid him every week and fed him twice a day, that back in the village they hadn't offered him that, and that he wasn't going anywhere as long as the master paid him. The younger one nodded. The carpenter said he was 50 years old, and that for the first time in 20 years, he was working in a place where people explain what to do instead of yelling at him, and that he wasn't going anywhere either. Ara said nothing. She simply sat down by the door and placed her sword on her lap. Her answer was obvious. So Rin took out the ledger and said they had enough in the account to cover 3 months' wages, and that she had a meeting with the team of porters in the morning regarding a transport contract. Dohwan nodded. He looked at Han Mei. She was sitting in the corner, twirling a dried root between her fingers. She caught his gaze. She said quietly that tomorrow she would have a new oil mixture ready for the crossbow bows. Dohwan nodded again. Then he sat down at the workbench. He picked up a piece of charcoal and began to sketch. Not a weapon, a plan for a workshop. Not a warehouse, a workshop. With 2 furnaces, with a separate room for alchemy, with a storage shed, with a proper roof. He drew and felt people sitting down next to him one by one. So Rin moved a candle closer. Ara leaned over his shoulder. Han Mei sat down beside him and quietly asked if her alchemy room could have a separate exhaust vent. Dohwan nodded and finished drawing the vent. They sat over the blueprint until midnight. 7 people in a dilapidated warehouse, with a single furnace, with a leaky roof, half of them bearing the mark of an outcast, with a guild inspector breathing down their necks, and with a plan for a workshop that didn't yet exist but already had a separate exhaust vent for the alchemy room. Dohwan looked at the drawing, then at the people around him, then back at the blueprint, and he thought that at the factory in Ulsan he had spent 12 years designing machines. And here, for the first time, he was designing something alive. Construction began in the 9th week. Dohwan bought a plot of land next to the warehouse from the portmaster for 20 silver coins. Half of the baron's advance went toward the land. So Rin argued with him for 2 days. She said he'd thrown the money down the drain. Dohwan replied that the drain was the foundation, and the foundation is the first thing you build. So Rin fell silent and went to recalculate the budget. Building the workshop on their own was impossible. They had 8 men, and all of them were busy working on the baron's order. Dohwan hired a crew of masons from the port, 6 strong men on a daily wage. He gave them the blueprint and explained what he needed. 2 smelting halls, a grinding room, and an alchemical laboratory with a separate exhaust hood. A warehouse for raw materials, a shed for finished products. The masons looked at the blueprint as if it were a treasure map. The foreman said that in 20 years of masonry work, he had never once been given a blueprint. Usually they just say, "Here's a wall, and here's a door. Figure it out yourself." Dohwan replied that without a blueprint, the wall would go up crooked. And a crooked wall means a crooked furnace. And a crooked furnace means a crooked spear. And a crooked spear means a dead soldier. The mason scratched the back of his head and said that no one had ever explained to him like that why a wall had to be straight. They started digging the foundation. Dohwan stood nearby and watched. Not because he didn't trust the masons, because he physically couldn't help but watch how they laid the stones. Perfect Assembly worked on the construction site too. He saw where the soil was soft and needed backfilling, where the mortar was too runny, where a stone had a crack and would in a year. At first, the masons were annoyed. Then they got used to it. Then they started asking him themselves. While construction was underway, production didn't stop. The old warehouse ran 2 shifts. The morning shift worked on spears. The evening shift worked on repairs for the city market. Dohwan rushed back and forth between the construction site and the workbench. He slept 4 hours a night. He ate on the go. So Rin would force him to sit down at the table twice a day and set a bowl of rice in front of him. She said that no one needed a dead master. Dohwan ate and continued to sketch with his left hand while his right held the spoon. By the 10th week, the first 50 spears were delivered to the Baron. Half the order, on time. The Baron sent his armorer to inspect the shipment, an elderly sergeant with a sour expression. He checked every spear. He struck the butt against an oak log. He bent the shaft. He tested the tip with his fingernail. Out of 50, he rejected 2, a 4% defect rate. At Black Anvil, the standard defect rate upon delivery was 15%. Everyone knew this. No one said it out loud. The armorer took the spears and left in silence. But 3 days later, the Baron sent a letter. A short one. He was pleased. He asked if the workshop could take on another order after completing the current one. 200 spears, 50 crossbows. By the time Hwan had finished reading the letter, he realized the workshop wouldn't be able to handle it, not in its current state. 1 forge, 5 workers on the production line. Forging was still the bottleneck. Even with the new workshop that would be ready in a month. Even with 2 forges, 200 spears and 50 crossbows was a workload for 10 blacksmiths, not 5. He sat down with So Rin that evening and laid out the numbers. She listened, she calculated. Then she said she saw 2 options. The first was to turn down the Baron. The second was to find more people. Dohwan said there was a third option. So Rin raised an eyebrow. Dohwan explained, "Don't hire any more blacksmiths. Make the ones we have work faster. Not by working long shifts, but by using tools." He pulled out the sketch he'd drawn on his first day in this warehouse. A lever press, the simplest kind. An oak frame, an iron connecting rod, guides. The principle was elementary. A lever multiplies force. One person presses the handle and gets 5 times more force than they could generate with a hammer. For rough shaping of the tips, this meant that instead of 20 hammer blows, 3 presses of the press were needed, 3 times faster. So Rin looked at the drawing and clearly didn't understand how it worked. But she understood the numbers. If the press tripled the shaping speed, 5 workers would do the work of 10. Dohwan said it would take a week to build the press and 10 silver coins for materials. So Rin closed her eyes. She did the math in her head. She opened them. She said they had the money. But it was tight. If the press didn't work, they wouldn't even be able to fulfill the current order. Dohwan nodded. He knew. It was a risk, but without the press, the workshop would hit a ceiling and never grow beyond 5 workers and 1 furnace. He built the press himself. Or rather, he designed it and oversaw the work. A carpenter assembled the frame. His brothers forged the iron parts according to his blueprints. Han Mei mixed a special lubricant for the guides. Ara hauled oak beams from the sawmill. Everyone pitched in. The press was up and running on the 5th day. Rough, heavy. The wooden frame creaked. But Dohwan placed the heated tip blank on the anvil under the press. He pressed the lever. The connecting rod went down. The ram slammed into the blank. The metal yielded. One press. The blank flattened out evenly, without warping. Dohwan pressed a second time. Shaped. A third time. Done. The rough shaping of the tip. 3 movements. 30 seconds. Instead of 20 hammer blows in 3 minutes, the brothers stood nearby, watching with their mouths agape. The older one reached for the lever. Dohwan stepped aside. His brother pressed down. The blank settled. He pressed again. And again. He lifted the tip. He looked at it. Even. He did it. He, the man who had failed the trial of the body and couldn't lift a 3-pood hammer 100 times. He made the tip in 30 seconds, by pressing the lever with one hand. The brother looked at Dohwan and said one word. How? Dohwan replied that it was physics. The lever multiplies force. The longer the handle, the less force is required. His brother didn't understand, but he didn't need to understand. He just had to press the lever. That he knew how to do. Over the next 2 weeks, the workshop's productivity tripled. The bottleneck shifted from forging to polishing. Dohwan was already drafting a foot-powered polishing machine, but that was later. Right now, the main thing was to finish the Baron's order. By the 12th week, they had delivered everything. 100 lances, 30 crossbows, on time, 4% defect rate. The Baron paid in full and signed a new contract, 200 spears, 50 crossbows, 6-month deadline. The sum that So Rin had counted 3 times, smiling wider each time. They could breathe. The new workshop was 70% complete. The walls were up. The roof was almost finished. 2 furnaces were installed. An alchemy room with a fume hood for Han Mei. A polishing area. A warehouse. A shed. All that remained was the finishing touches and the small details. Dohwan stood in the middle of the new workshop and looked at the walls. Stone. Smooth. Just as he had drawn them. The furnaces were positioned correctly. The exhaust fan was working. The floor was covered in clay mixed with sand. Tamped down. Solid. This was his workshop. His first real workshop. In Ulsan, he had worked for 12 years on other people's machines in someone else's workshop. Here, everything was his. Every stone in the wall. Every beam in the roof, every furnace. He ran his hand along the wall. The stone was warm from the sun, rough, authentic. So Rin found him like that, standing in the middle of the empty workshop with his hand on the wall. She asked if everything was all right. Dohwan replied that it was, that he was just checking the masonry. So Rin didn't believe him, but didn't argue. She brought news. Inspector Gi Wan-su hadn't left Pyongyang. He'd rented a house on the outskirts and stayed. And 2 men had come to see him. Strangers, not locals, with guns. Ada had heard about it from the market vendors. 2 armed strangers in a small town are noticeable. Dohwan listened. He wasn't surprised. The inspector hadn't been able to shut down the workshop legally. So they'd try illegally. That's the logic of any monopoly. First, inspections, then pressure, then violence. He'd seen it at the factory in Ulsan when competitors tried to squeeze them out of the lock market. Only there, it was lawyers and tax audits. Here, it would be people with knives. Dohwan assembled a team that evening. He told them about the strangers. Ara listened calmly. She said that 2 of them weren't a problem. It would be a problem if there were 10. Dohwan nodded. He said they needed security, not just Ara, proper security, at least 4 people, 2 during the day, 2 at night. Sorin said that was expensive, 8 copper coins a day, 240 a month. Dohwan replied that the new workshop cost 300 silver coins. If they burned it down, 240 copper coins for security would seem like a laughable sum. Sorin nodded. Ara said she knew some people, former mercenaries. Not the best, but reliable.
Honest within the terms of a paid contract, Dohwan asked her to bring them tomorrow. Ara brought 3, 2 men and a woman, strong, calm, with weapons that had seen battle. Dohwan looked at them and immediately asked to see their swords. All 3 were surprised, but showed them.
Dohwan ran each sword through the perfect assembly. The first mercenary's blade had a micro crack at the guard. It would shatter with a strong blow. The second's hilt was loose. The third's balance was acceptable, but the edge was dull. Dohwan said he would repair all 3 for free, as part of the first month's security fee. The mercenaries exchanged glances. Then the senior one said that in 20 years of service, not a single employer had ever repaired his weapon. Usually they just say, "Bring your own and don't complain." Dohwan replied that he didn't need security guards with swords full of holes. It's the same as a leaky roof. Sooner or later, it'll start leaking. The mercenaries laughed. And they stayed. Dohwan repaired their swords in 2 evenings. He welded the micro crack in the first one in the forge. He rewrapped the hilt of the second. He sharpened the third. He returned each sword in better condition than he had received it. The mercenaries looked at their weapons and said nothing. Then the leader said that if the master paid on time and repaired the swords for free, they would guard this workshop, even against the king himself. Dohwan replied that he didn't need protection from the king. 2 strangers with knives were enough for now. A week passed. The strangers didn't show up. Dohwan didn't let his guard down. He knew that the first silence was reconnaissance. The second silence was preparation. The third silence was the last one before the strike. On the 14th week, they struck, at night. Dohwan woke up to Ara's scream. She was standing by the workshop window with her sword drawn. Outside the window, flashes of fire. Someone had set the shed with the finished spears on fire, 20 of them, ready to be sent to the Baron. They were burning. Dohwan rushed outside. The shed was ablaze. 2 mercenaries from the night shift lay against the wall. One was unconscious with a fractured skull. The other was on his feet, but staggering. They'd been taken out silently, professionally. Ara rushed toward the shed. Dohwan grabbed her by the arm. The spears were beyond saving. The fire had reached the wood, and the iron was red hot. But the workshop was nearby. If the fire spread to the walls... He looked at the stone walls of the new workshop. Stone doesn't burn, but the roof is wooden, and there's a forge inside with coal. If the fire reaches the forge... Dohwan turned and ran toward the workshop. "Don't put out the shed! Save the workshop!" he shouted at the workers. They ran out of the barracks half-dressed. He directed them. Buckets of water, wet rags on the roof, sand on the ground around the walls. 8 minutes. The shed burned down. 20 spears were lost, but the workshop stood. The walls were sooty. The roof was wet but intact. The furnace was untouched. Toward morning, a city guard arrived. That very same Uncle Park, with that very spear. He examined the evidence, found a rag soaked in oil. The arsonist knew what they were doing. Pak said he saw 2 men running toward the port, strangers. Dohwan nodded. 20 spears, 3 weeks of work. He stood before the charred canopy and counted. The losses, the time to rebuild, the order would be delayed. He needed to inform the Baron. He needed to explain. He needed to propose a new deadline. And he needed to make sure this didn't happen again. Sorin stood nearby, pale and angry. She said it was Guy, the inspector, his doing. Dohwan replied that it was most likely so, but there was no proof. Ara sheathed her sword. She said she didn't need proof. She knew where the inspector lived. Dohwan shook his head. He said no, not like that. Ara clenched her jaw. She asked, "Then how?" Dohwan paused. Then he answered. They would restore the shipment. In 2 weeks, they would send it to the Baron, and they'll write him a letter, a detailed one, describing the arson, requesting an investigation. The Baron is a military man. He doesn't like it when someone burns his property. And the spears that burned had already been paid for. Formally, it's the Baron's property. Someone set fire to the border baron's property. This is no longer a guild dispute. It's a crime against a nobleman. So Rin nodded slowly. She looked at Dohwan with new eyes. Then she said she would write the letter today. Dohwan returned to the workshop. He sat down at the forge. His hands were shaking. Not from the cold, not from adrenaline, from anger. Quiet, calculated. 20 spears, 3 weeks of work. Someone's life on the front lines depends on these spears, and someone burned them to protect a monopoly on junk that breaks after the third strike. He took a piece of coal. He began to sketch. A new shed, made of stone, with an iron door, with a lock. They won't lose anything else. The Baron replied 5 days later. The letter was short, 3 lines. I will find the culprits. I expect the shipment on time. Do not disappoint me. Dohwan read and put the letter away. 3 lines from a military man is serious business. The Baron wasn't threatening. The Baron was promising. A week later, Inspector Gi Won-soo left Pyongyang, quietly, at night, without goodbyes. His house on the outskirts stood empty. 2 strangers had disappeared even earlier. Ara checked. They left via the port on a fishing boat the day after the arson. Professionals. They came, they did it, they left. The Baron didn't find them, but he found something else. 2 weeks later, a messenger from the Baron arrived in Pyongyang with news. Yoon Sang-ho had filed a complaint with the Royal Chancellery against the Blacksmiths Guild for the destruction of military property. The complaint was accepted. An investigation has been ordered. The Black Anvil would have to answer for it. So Rin read this and, for the first time in Dohwan's presence, laughed out loud. Quickly, dryly, like someone who had waited a long time and finally saw the pendulum swing the other way. Dohwan did not share her joy. He knew that investigations take a long time, that the guild would hire troublemakers, that the case would get bogged down in paperwork for months. But a stir had been created, the first public crack in the Black Anvil's reputation. That was enough for now. He returned to work. A batch of 20 copies was restored in 12 days. The press helped. A new stone canopy with iron door was built in a week. Security was beefed up to 6 people. Ara personally drew up a schedule for night patrols. Dohwan looked at her schedule and said it was a job well done. Ara grumbled that this wasn't her first year guarding other people's property. Dohwan replied that it wasn't someone else's. It was theirs. Ara fell silent. Then she went on. By the end of the 4th month, the workshop was running smoothly. 2 furnaces, 2 presses. Dohwan built the second one in 3 days, modeling it after the first. 8 workers on the production floor, 6 guards. Han Mei in the lab, So Rin in the office. Ara was everywhere. 30 copies a month, 10 crossbows, consistently. Defect rate under 5%. But Dohwan couldn't shake the feeling that they were working at their limit. Not the equipment, the people. 8 workers, all at maximum capacity. One got sick last week. The line stopped for half a day because there was no one to fill in for him. Everyone has their own operation, their own specialization. This is both the strength and weakness of the division of labor. The system is fast, but fragile. Dohwan thought about this at night. We need more than just a workshop. We need a school. A place where people learn the operations in advance, where everyone knows at least 2 or 3 operations and can fill in for a colleague. But a school takes time, money, space, and a teacher. And the only teacher in the workshop is himself. The 5th month began with a strange visit. A girl approached the workshop gate. Young, about 19, in a simple dress with a canvas bag slung over her shoulder. The guard stopped her. She said she was looking for Master John, that she'd heard he needed someone who could do math. The guard called for Dohwan. Dohwan came out and saw a thin girl with large, serious eyes and an ink stain on her index finger. She introduced herself as Park Chi-yoon, the daughter of a sergeant who had died in the war. She grew up at a temple school. She does mental math, quickly. She's looking for a job. Dohwan asked who told her he needed an accountant. Chi-yoon replied that it was So-rin. They met at the market. So-rin was complaining to a vendor that she couldn't handle the paperwork on her own. Chi-yoon was standing nearby and heard it. Dohwan looked at So-rin. She was standing in the office doorway, pretending not to listen. Dohwan smirked. So-rin would never have asked for help directly. She was too proud. But complaining at the market so that the right person would hear, that was a clever move. Dohwan turned to Chi-yoon and asked what 347 multiplied by 23 would be. Chi-yoon blinked, then she said 7,981. Dohwan checked in his head. Correct. He asked another question. If the workshop produces 32 spears a month and the defect rate is 4%, how many usable spears will reach the customer in 6 months? Chi-yoon paused for 3 seconds. Then she answered 184. Dohwan did the math. 192 minus 4%. 184 and 3/10. She had rounded down. Correct. You can't ship 3/10 of a spear. He nodded. He said she was hired. He asked when she could start. Chi-yoon replied that she could start right away. Dohwan took her to So-rin. He said Chi-yoon would be taking over the bookkeeping. All of it. Income, expenses, salaries, inventory. So-rin raised an eyebrow. She asked, all of it? Dohwan confirmed it. He said he didn't have time to do the math. So-rin didn't have time to do the math and sell at the same time. Chi-yoon does the accounting. So-rin sells. He does it. Division of labor. So-rin looked at Chi-yoon. Chi-yoon looked at So-rin. Something elusive flashed between them. A cautious recognition. Two women whom the world had taught not to trust. So-rin because trust had taken her home away from her. Chi-yoon because she was never given trust. So-rin took out the ledger. Thick, worn. She placed it in front of Chi-yoon. She said, figure it out. Dohwan returned to the workshop. 3 days later, Chi-yoon came to him with the ledger and a 12-point list. Discrepancies in the accounts. 2 errors in payroll calculations. 1 error in raw material accounting. 9 places where the entries were illegible and needed to be reconstructed from memory. Dohwan looked at the list. Then he looked at Chi-yoon. He asked if she had slept at all during those 3 days. Chi-yoon hesitated and said she had slept. A little. Dohwan said there was a rule in the workshop. The workday was 10 hours. After that, rest. If he saw her working at night, he'd deduct it from her pay. Chi-yoon opened her mouth, closed it. Then she quietly asked if it was true. Dohwan replied that it wasn't, that it was a joke, but she still needed to sleep. Chi-yoon smiled, for the first time since she'd arrived. So-rin stood in the doorway and watched that smile. Then she quietly returned to her papers. With Chi-young, bookkeeping was no longer a problem. She calculated faster than So-rin could write. She found a way to save on coal transportation. She drew up a payroll schedule so that payments were distributed evenly and there were no cash flow gaps. She worked 12 hours a day despite the rule, and Dohwan pretended not to notice, because he himself worked 14. By the end of the 5th month, the workshop turned a steady profit for the first time. Not a huge one, but steady. After all expenses, there was a net profit of 15 silver coins a month. With that money, they could save, or expand, or both. Dohwan chose to expand. He began building a 3rd forge and a school. A single room next to the workshop, with a workbench, with a drafting board, with a set of tools. Every evening after the shift, he gathered the workers and taught them. Not everyone wanted to learn. 2 of the new workers said outright that they were being paid for forging, not for school. Dohwan replied that anyone who mastered an additional operation would receive a bonus. 2 copper coins a day. The workers exchanged glances. 2 copper coins isn't much, but that adds up to 60 a month, and a year. They stayed. They learned. They grumbled, but they learned. By the middle of the 6th month, every worker in the workshop knew at least 2 operations. The system became more robust. When the younger brother came down with a cold, he was replaced by a carpenter at the forging station and a newcomer at the grinding station. The line didn't stop. Dohwan stood in the workshop and watched the people work. Without him, following his drawings, following his process charts, following his system. They didn't need him for every specific action. He was needed for the system to exist. That was the difference between a master craftsman and a process engineer. A master craftsman makes a thing. A process engineer makes a system that makes things. That evening, Sorin called him by name for the first time. Not Master Jeong, not Master. Dohwan. Simply, quietly, over dinner, across the table. She said that Dohwan was right about the school, and that Chi-Yun had calculated that the extra fees for the additional surgeries had paid for themselves in the very first month. Dohwan nodded, said he knew. Sorin snorted and replied that he always knew, that it was annoying. Dohwan replied that he didn't always know, that sometimes he just thought faster than he admitted he doesn't know. Sorin looked at him for a long time. Then she poured him some more tea. It was a small moment, insignificant, but Dohwan remembered it, because it was the first time anyone in this world had seen him not as a master or a technician, but simply as a human being. In the 8th month, Dohwan went down to the basement, not on business, just... A rat had gnawed through a sack of salt, and the salt was spilling down through a crack in the floor. He went down to patch the hole, and saw that the basement was much larger than it appeared from above. The old salt merchant's warehouse stood on a stone foundation, and beneath the main room stretched a low, vaulted space crammed with sacks, barrels, and debris. Dohwan lit a lantern and went deeper inside, not out of curiosity, for practical reasons. If the cellar was large enough, it could be used as an additional storage area. Dry, cool, with a constant temperature, ideal for storing Hanmei oils. He made his way between the barrels and sacks, dust, cobwebs, the smell of old salt. And suddenly, the lantern illuminated something hard and dark against the far wall. An iron chest, small, about the size of a toolbox, rusty but sturdy, with a lock, and with a brand on the lid. Dohwan brought the lantern closer. The brand. He recognized it. The memory of a foreign body. It was his father's brand, the real father of this body. Dohwan Sr., the master who died when the boy was 12. Dohwan sat down on the stone floor in front of the chest. The lock was rusted solid. He went back upstairs for a tool. He took a chisel and a hammer. He went back down. He knocked the lock off. It crumbled into rusty dust. He opened the lid. Inside lay papers, rolled into a tube, tied with a string. He took them out. His hands didn't tremble. He unfolded the first sheet, and the world stopped. A blueprint, a casting mold, with tolerances in millimeters, tolerances in millimeters. In a world where craftsmen work by eye and measure length in palms and fingers, someone had drawn it in millimeters. Dohwan flipped the sheet over. A signature on the back. Hangul, Korean Hangul, which doesn't exist in this world. The signature read, Kim Jong-ho, 973 of the Songryo era. He took out the second sheet, a drawing of a water hammer with a gear transmission, with power calculations. The third sheet, a diagram of a blast furnace. The fourth, a recipe for crucible steel, with temperatures, with proportions. The fifth, a diagram of a lathe. The sixth, the seventh, the eighth. 15 drawings, each with tolerances in millimeters, each with a signature in Hangul, each with a date. 973, 974, 975. It is now the year 1003. These drawings were made 30 years ago. Dohwan sat on the stone floor of the basement and looked at the papers. Kim Jong-ho, a Korean name, Korean script, blueprints with tolerances in millimeters, industrial technologies that don't exist in this world. Someone was here before him,
Someone from Korea. Someone from his world. 30 years ago. This person ended up here, just like him. And this person was drawing, designing, trying to build. A water hammer, a blast furnace, a lathe. These were technologies that were supposed to change this world. And they didn't. Because the blueprints lay in a chest in the basement of a forgotten warehouse. Kim Jong-ho didn't see it through to the end. He died. Or he was killed. Or he disappeared. But his blueprints remained. And the only person who knew about them was Dohwan Sr., the father of this body, who also died, before he could pass on his knowledge to his son. Dohwan put the blueprints back in the trunk, closed the lid, went upstairs. He didn't tell anyone, not because he didn't trust them, because he didn't know what to say.
He's a time traveler from 21st century Korea, and he's not the first. There was another before him, 30 years ago. And this world seems to attract engineers on its own. Why? Who's behind it? These were questions he had no answers to, for now. He put those thoughts on the back burner, not because they weren't important, because right now he didn't have the tools to solve them. And an engineer without tools works with what he has. That evening, he took the water hammer blueprint out of the chest, carried it to his room, spread it out on the workbench, ran it through ideal assembly. The clicking in his head was deafening. The blueprint was brilliant, and flawed in 3 places. The gear on the drive shaft is too thin. It would shear the teeth in the 3rd month. The bearing had no lubrication groove. It would seize up. The frame was wooden. It would rot from moisture within a year. But the basic idea was flawless. A water hammer with a gear drive. Set it up on the river. Use the current. The hammer would strike tirelessly, without a human, day and night. This wasn't a press. This is the next level. Dohwan looked at the blueprint and saw it. This Kim Jong-ho was good, very good, perhaps better than he was himself. But Kim Jong-ho was alone. No team, no So-rin counting the money, no Ah-ra guarding the doors, no Han-mei making the oil, no Chi-yoon keeping the books. He was alone, and he couldn't handle it. Dohwan took a piece of charcoal and began correcting the blueprint. A thicker gear, a grooved bearing, a frame of stone and iron. Next to the corrections, he wrote in Korean, Kim Jong-ho si. I'll finish it. Then he erased it. Sentimentality, not his style. But the thought remained. The next morning, he showed the corrected water hammer blueprint to So-rin. She looked at it. She asked where it came from. Dohwan said he found it in the basement, in his father's trunk. So-rin asked if his father knew how to draw like that. Dohwan paused and replied that his father had studied under a good master. So-rin didn't ask any further. But she looked at Dohwan as if she had seen another door in him that he was keeping closed. Dohwan what a water hammer was. A wheel on the river. The water turns it. Gears transmit the motion. The hammer strikes. Without a person. So-rin listened. Then she asked how much it would cost to build. Dohwan named a figure, 100 silver coins. So-rin said that was all they had, all their profits for 4 months. Dohwan nodded. So-rin was silent for a moment. Then she said that if the hammer worked, it would replace 3 blacksmiths, and it would pay for itself in 2 months. Dohwan confirmed this. So-rin took out the ledger. She opened it. She counted. She closed it. She said, let's build it. It took 6 weeks to build the water hammer. They chose a spot on the river, a half-hour walk from the workshop, a stone foundation, a wooden wheel, iron gears that Dohwan designed himself and that the brothers forged according to his drawings, the hammer on a suspension, the anvil on a stone slab. The whole structure creaked and groaned but stood firm. Dohwan performed the startup himself. He opened the sluice gate. Water gushed onto the wheel's blades. The wheel turned. The gears meshed. The hammer rose and struck. The roar was so loud that the fishermen on the river dropped their rods. The hammer struck evenly, powerfully, a blow every 3 seconds, tirelessly, without pause. Dohwan placed a workpiece on the anvil. The hammer struck. The workpiece flattened in a second, perfectly, evenly, more powerfully than any blacksmith. The brothers stood and watched. The carpenter took off his hat. One of the new workers sat down on the ground and said it was witchcraft. Dohwan replied that it was hydraulics. The worker didn't understand, but he understood perfectly well the blanks the hammer stamped out in a second. By the 9th month, the workshop was producing 60 spears and 20 crossbows a month, twice as many as 3 months ago, with the same number of workers. The water hammer ran around the clock. All that was needed only be fed with blanks and have the finished products removed. Dohwan looked at the river, at the spinning wheel, at the striking hammer, and thought of Kim Jong-ho, of the man who had drawn this blueprint 30 years ago and did not live to see it in operation. "Thank you." He said this aloud, quietly, to himself alone. The river didn't answer. The hammer struck again. The 10th month began with a funeral. A junior apprentice named Tech, 17 years old. He'd come to the workshop in the 6th week. A quiet guy, diligent. He learned slowly, but what he learned, he held on to tightly. He specialized in polishing arrowheads. Dohwan remembered how he taught him to hold the stone, how he showed him the angle, how Tech filed the blank crookedly 10 times in a row, but on the 11th try, suddenly did it perfectly and looked at his hands as if they didn't belong to him. Dohwan told him then that hands remember better than the head. Tech smiled. It was the only smile Dohwan had ever seen from him. Tech died that night, the second arson. Not a shed this time, a warehouse with raw materials. Someone doused the wall with oil and set it on fire. Tech was sleeping in an outbuilding nearby. The smoke took him before the flames did. The guards caught one of the arsonists, a mercenary, not from Pyongyang, hired in the capital. Ara interrogated him personally. He gave a name, not Giwon-su, someone higher up. Someone from the Black Anvil Council. No direct order, a middleman, a chain. The ends are hidden, professional. Tuck was buried in the city cemetery by the sea. Dohwan stood by the grave and said nothing. The workers stood behind him. So, Rin, Ara, Hanmei, Chi-yun, everyone. Taegu was 17. He came to the workshop because he wanted to learn how to make things. He learned, and then he choked on smoke in the annex because someone in the capital didn't like that the spears from Pyongyang didn't break. Dohwan didn't cry. He stood there and counted. It was the only thing he knew how to do with his pain. Count. The thickness of the annex wall, the distance from the wall to Tuck's bed, the time it took for oil to burn on stone, the time it took for the room to fill with smoke. 8 minutes. If the wall had been a palm's width thicker, if the door had opened outward instead of inward, if there had been a window in the annex, Tai would have survived. These weren't abstract thoughts. They were blueprints, improvements he hadn't made in time, because he'd been thinking about presses and hammers and crossbows, and hadn't thought about the fact that people were sleeping in a building that could catch fire. After the funeral, Dohwan didn't sleep for 3 days, not because he couldn't, because he was working. He remodeled all the living quarters, cut out windows, installed doors that opened outward, reinforced the walls with sand fill, placed water barrels every 10 steps, wrote evacuation instructions, with a blueprint, with numbers, with arrows pointing the way. He nailed them to the wall in every room. He conducted a practice evacuation. He timed it. 4 minutes. Too long. It needs to be 2. He redesigned the route, conducted it again. 2.5. One more time. 2 minutes and 10 seconds. Close. At the end of the 3rd day, So-rin found him sitting on the workshop floor with a piece of coal in his hand. He was drawing on the floor. His eyes were red. His hands were shaking, not from weakness, but because his body refused to stay awake while his mind wouldn't stop. So-rin sat down next to him, silently, for a long time. Then she said it wasn't his fault. Dohwan didn't answer. She said Taika had been killed by arsonists, not by faulty walls. Dohwan still didn't answer. She spoke more softly. What if he broke down now? The workshop wouldn't survive. That without him, they were all just people in a stone building. That he needed to sleep. Dohwan finally lifted his head. He looked at her. He said the walls were bad. That he knew. That he should have done something sooner. So Rin replied that in this world, there are always things that should have been done sooner. That this isn't a reason to go without sleep for 3 days. That she's seen people break before, and this is exactly what it looks like. Dohwan was silent for a moment. Then he stood up. He put the coal on the workbench. He went to his room. He lay down on the bed and slept for 14 hours. When he came out in the morning, Ara was standing at the door to his room. She said that while he was sleeping, a letter had arrived from the Baron. The Baron is offering to station a permanent detachment of 10 soldiers in Pyongyang to guard the workshop, at the Baron's expense, in exchange for priority in orders. Dohwan read the letter. He looked at Ara. She nodded. It was a good move. The Baron's soldiers weren't mercenaries. They were part of the regular army. Arsonists would think twice before attacking a facility under military guard. Dohwan wrote a reply. He agreed. A week later, 10 of the Baron's soldiers set up camp near the workshop, with tents, with campfires, with the Baron's flag flying on a pole. The arson attack stopped. The workshop got back to work. But something had changed. Dohwan could feel it. The workers were quieter. Without their usual jokes and bickering, Taika was missing. A new man had taken his place at the grinding wheel. He worked well, but he wasn't Taika. Dohwan stood at the workbench and thought about how people were dying in Ulsan too. Accidents, workplace injuries, he'd seen it. But at the factory, a commission would come after every incident. They wrote a report, they changed the regulations, they installed safety measures. There was no commission here. Here, it was him. And the responsibility was his, all of it, entirely. In the 11th month, Dohwan made a decision. He opened a second workshop, not in Pyongyang, in Namhae, a small town 2 days' drive to the west, a port town, a fishing town, with its own market square and garrison. The decision wasn't emotional, so Rin showed him the numbers. Demand for the products was growing faster than they could produce. Orders from 2 barons, requests from the city guards of 4 cities, fishing cooperatives all along the coast. One workshop couldn't keep up. A second one was needed. Dohwan couldn't be in 2 places at once, so the second workshop had to operate without him, according to his system, according to his blueprints, according to his process charts, but without his personal presence. This was a real test, not for the workshop, for the system. Dohwan sent his older brother to Namhae, the most experienced of the workers. He gave him a folder with blueprints, process charts for every operation, a list of tools, a 3-month budget, and 1 instruction. If anything is unclear, write a letter. But first, reread the chart. His brother left with 3 new workers who had been recruited in Pyongyang and trained over the course of a month. Sorin went with them for the first week, to open a bank account, to rent a space, to sign a contract with the local baron. Chi-Yun stayed behind to handle the bookkeeping for both workshops in Pyongyang. She was now working 16 hours a day, and Dohwan was no longer joking about deductions from her salary. Instead, he sat down next to her one evening and said she needed an assistant. Chi-Yun shook her head and replied that she could handle it. Dohwan said he had no doubt, but he asked why she should handle it alone when she could train someone and handle it together. Chi-Yun fell silent. Then she said quietly that she was afraid. What if the assistant was better at accounting than she was, and then she would no longer be needed? Dohwan looked at her, at this young woman who, at 19, had already learned to fear her own replaceability. He said that Chi-Yun was irreplaceable, not because he thought she was better than everyone else, but because she was the first to teach these people to trust numbers rather than their eyes. The assistant would do the counting. Chi-Yun would teach him how to count. Those were different things. Chi-Yun sat in silence for a long time. Then she nodded. A week later, she had an assistant, a boy from the temple school, 15 years old. He counted more slowly than she did, but he tried hard. Jeong taught him with a patience that Dohwan hadn't expected from her. The second workshop in Namhae began operations a month later, with glitches, with mistakes. The first batch of copies came in with an 8% defect rate, twice the norm. Dohwan read the report and wasn't surprised. He sent a detailed letter analyzing the errors. His brother corrected them. The second batch was 5%, the third, 4%. The system was working, slowly, with friction, but it was working. By the end of the 11th month, 23 people were working in the two workshops. They were producing 120 copies and 40 crossbows a month. That was more than the Black Anvil branch in Pyonghae produced in 6 months. So Rin compiled a report and showed it to Dohwan. He read the numbers and realized they had passed the point of no return. They could no longer be shut down quietly. Too many people, too many orders, too many barons who depended on their spears. The Black Anvil understood this too. And the next blow would not be arson. The blow came from where Dohwan did not expect it. Not fire, not mercenaries, paper. So Rin brought the news at dawn on the 12th month. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. A complaint had been filed with the Royal Chancellery against the Pyonghan workshop, on behalf of 3 respected citizens of the city. The gist of the complaint? The self-proclaimed blacksmith Jeong Dohwan, without a brand and without a license and no right to practice his trade, is manufacturing weapons for rebellion. He sells them to border barons, bypassing the guild. He is gathering strength. He is building fortifications. He keeps an armed detachment at his side. He is preparing an uprising against the crown. Dohwan listened. He was silent. Then he asked who had signed the complaint. So Rin named 3 people, 2 merchants and 1 foreman of a fishing cooperative. All 3 had contracts with the Black Anvil. All 3 were losing money because the fishermen were now sharpening their knives not at the guild's forge, but at Dohwan's. It all made sense. A blow to their reputation. The word rebellion at court is no joke. It means an investigation. It means a royal auditor. It means a freeze on all contracts until the matter is resolved. So Rin said that if the auditor arrived and saw the baron's soldiers around the workshop, the denunciation would seem very convincing. A civilian blacksmith under military guard, with an arsenal of spears and crossbows. It looks exactly as described in the denunciation. Dohwan nodded. She was right. He asked So-rin to contact the baron and request that the soldiers be temporarily withdrawn. So-rin objected that without the soldiers, the workshop would be open to another attack. Dohwan replied that they would survive an attack. There was no charge of treason. The soldiers left 2 days later, quietly. The baron understood the situation. He sent a letter, a short one. Hang in there. The inspector arrived a week later, not alone, with a secretary and 4 guards in royal colors. The inspector's name was Oh Jong-gyu, short, thin, with the face of a man who has spent his whole life reading other people's papers and trusts no one. He arrived in the morning and, first thing, demanded an inspection of all the workshop's property, every room, every tool, every item. Dohwan let him in without a word. The inspector walked around for 3 hours. He counted. He wrote things down. He touched things. He tapped on the walls. He peered into the furnaces. He lifted the lids off the barrels. He sniffed the oil in Han Mei's lab. He counted the spears in the warehouse, 48 of them, ready for shipment. When he finished, he sat down at the desk in So-rin's office and asked for the documents. Everything. Dohwan was ready. Chi-yun had been working on this for 3 days. A stack of papers as thick as a finger lay before the auditor. Contracts with the baron, invoices for iron, acceptance certificates, process charts, accounting ledgers, payroll records. The contract with Han Mei for oil supplies. The contract with the Masons Guild for construction. Bills for coal. Bills for lumber. Receipts for every penny. The auditor read for 4 hours, in silence. He turned page after page. Sometimes he made notes in the margins. Sometimes he went back to the previous page and checked the numbers. Chi-yun sat across from him, holding her breath. This was her test. Every number in those books had been written by her hand. Every single one. Over 9 months. The auditor finished. He looked up. He looked at Chi-yun, then at Dohwan. He asked who had kept these books. Dohwan pointed to Chi-young. The auditor paused. Then he said that in 20 years of service, he had never seen such immaculate ledgers at a workshop 3 times this size. Not a single discrepancy. Chi-young blushed to her ears. Then the auditor moved on to the main point. He placed 3 spears on the table. 1 from Dohwan's workshop, 2 from the Black Anvil Guild Forge. Dohwan recognized the trick. The inspector wanted to compare them, himself, with his own eyes. Dohwan didn't wait for questions. He stepped out from behind the table, picked up a hammer, and asked the inspector to choose any one of the 3 spears. The inspector pointed to the guild one. Dohwan placed it on the stone floor and struck the shaft with the hammer. Not hard, precisely. Right where the shaft entered the socket, the spear fell apart. The tip flew off, the shaft cracked. The inspector raised his eyebrows. Dohwan picked up the second guild spear. He struck it the same way, same spot, same force. The spear fell apart. A little later, but it fell apart. Dohwan took his own. He struck it. The spear hummed, but it didn't fall apart. He struck it again, harder. A ringing sound, a vibration, still intact. A third time, a fourth, a fifth. The Pyongyang spear lay on the floor, intact, with a dent in the shaft, but intact. The inspector silently picked up the fragments of the guild spears. He turned them over in his hands. He looked at the break. Then he looked at the Pyongyang spear, then at Dohwan. He asked why. Dohwan explained. The fit of the tip on the shaft. On the black anvil, the ferrule is loose. The tip is held in place by friction and glue. The glue dries out. The friction weakens. The spear falls apart. His has a tight fit. With a tolerance of 1/10 of a finger, plus a locking pin through the sleeve and shaft, plus Hanmei's hardening oil, which provides even hardening without brittle zones. The inspector listened. He took notes. Then he asked one last question. Where had Master Jeong learned all this? Dohwan paused. Then he replied that his father had taught him, and that his father had learned from a master from distant lands. It was the truth. Not the whole truth, but the truth. The inspector left on the 3rd day. He didn't say a word about the results. Dohwan didn't wait. He knew that bureaucracy moves slowly. The results would come in a month, or 2, or 3. Sorin was nervous. Ada was sharpening her sword. Hanmei was making oil as usual. Chi-yun recounted all the books again in case of a re-audit. Dohwan went back to work, not because he wasn't worried, because work was the only thing he could control. While the auditor was writing his report, Dohwan made spears. Every day, every spear. Quality that speaks for itself. In the 13th month, the answer came. So-rin received a letter bearing the royal seal. She opened it. She read it. She was silent. Dohwan waited. So-rin raised her head. She said the complaint had been dismissed. The workshop was deemed legitimate. Inspector Oh Jung-gil wrote in his report that production in Pyongyang was conducted within the law, that the quality of the products exceeded the guild standard, and that closing the workshop would harm the defense capabilities of the southern border. The last line was unexpected. The inspector recommended that the Royal Chancellery consider granting Master an independent hallmark, not a guild one, a royal one. Dohwan reread the letter. Then again. A royal hallmark. It was more than he had expected. It wasn't just permission to operate. It was recognition. Official. State-sanctioned. So-rin neatly folded the letter. She put it in the safe. Then she turned to Dohwan and said that this wasn't the seal yet. It was a recommendation. Only the king himself could issue the seal. Dohwan nodded. He knew. A year could pass between a recommendation and a seal, or two, or never. But the inspector's recommendation was a shield. With it, no inspector would dare to interfere. No denunciation would get through. At least, not until the court decided otherwise. They had bought some time. That evening, the entire workshop gathered around a long table in the courtyard. 23 people. Workers from both workshops, guards, So-rin, Ara, Han-mei, Chi-yun, Do-hwan. They ate. They drank. The brothers had hauled a keg of beer from the port. Someone was playing the flute. Badly, but cheerfully. Do-hwan sat at the edge of the table and looked at these people. A year ago, he had woken up on the dirt floor with the mark of an outcast on his arm and a hammer with a cracked handle. Today he had 2 workshops, 23 people, a water hammer on the river, a recommendation for the royal seal, and people who trust him. Not because he's strong, not because he's rich, because the things he makes don't break. Han-mei sat down next to him, silently. She placed a small bottle on the table. New oil, for blades. That very third formula they'd been discussing for months. She said she'd finished the tests. It works. Dohwan picked up the bottle. He looked at it in the light. Dark, thick. It smelled of bitterness and flowers. He opened the cap and sniffed. Then he closed it. He said they'd try it tomorrow. Han-mei nodded. They sat side by side. The notebook with the formulas lay between them on the table. Dohwan flipped through the pages. Han-mei explained what she had changed in the composition. Quietly, in detail. He listened. She pointed to the formulas. Their hands ended up on the same page, close together. Not touching, but close. Chi-yun noticed this. She smiled into her mug. Ada noticed it too. She didn't smile, but she didn't frown either. So-rin didn't notice. She was calculating the expenses for the holiday dinner. In the 14th month, a woman arrived in Pyongyang whom no one was expecting. She came on foot, with a roll of papers under her arm, in travel clothes covered in dust from the 3 provinces. The guard at the gate stopped her. She said she wanted to see Master Chan. The guard asked what the matter was. She unrolled one of the scrolls and showed it to him. The guard looked at it. He didn't understand a single line. He called Ara. Ara looked at it too. She didn't understand it either, but something in those lines made her frown. She called Do-hwan. Do-hwan came out of the workshop. He wiped his hands with a rag. He looked at the woman. Tall, thin, hair pulled back into a bun, a weathered face, eyes that were sharp and tired at the same time. The eyes of someone who had searched for a long time and finally found the door, but wasn't sure if what she needed was behind it. She introduced herself as So-hee-ra, from the kingdom of Marin, the daughter of a court clockmaker. She said she had heard of a workshop in Pyongyang that made weapons better than those of the Black Anvil, that she had been traveling for 2 months, that she wanted to show him her blueprints. Do-hwan held out his hand. She handed him a scroll. He unrolled it and froze. A crossbow, but not like the ones he repaired. Different, with a screw-type cocking mechanism, with an automatic reloading mechanism, with a magazine for 5 bolts. The blueprint was detailed, with dimensions, not in millimeters, in local units, but precise, very precise. Do-hwan ran it through the perfect assembly. The clicking in his head grew so loud that he closed his eyes for a second. The blueprint glowed. Red dots in 3 places. The spring. It'll snap on the 100th shot. The tolerance on the magazine guide is too tight. It'll jam in the rain. And the third spot wasn't a mistake. The third spot was a solution Do-hwan wouldn't have come up with himself. A hinged bow mount. Allows the bow to be replaced in the field in a minute. No tools, just with your hands. It was genius. Do-hwan raised his head and looked at So-hee-ra. She stood there waiting, fingers clenched, jaw tight. She was waiting for what she'd heard her whole life. This is nonsense. It's impossible. It's a woman's whim. Get lost. Dohwan poked his finger at the drawing, at the first red spot. He said the spring here was too thin. It'll snap on the 100th shot. It needs to be a third thicker or made of a different alloy. He poked at the second one. He said the tolerance on the magazine needed to be loosened. Otherwise, in wet weather, the bolt wouldn't come out. He pointed to the third spot. He fell silent for a second. Then he said that the hinged bow mount was the best engineering solution he'd ever seen in this world, that he wouldn't have thought of it himself, that it was genius. Sohira stood there. She was silent. Then her knees buckled and she sat right down on the ground in the middle of the courtyard. The guard moved toward her. Ara stopped him with a hand. Sohira sat on the ground and looked up at Dohwan. Then she said one word. Finally. Dohwan crouched down in front of her. He said she needed to eat and rest. Sohira shook her head. She said she needed a workshop, a workbench, tools, and a man who understands her blueprints. She had been looking for such a man for 13 years, ever since she assembled her first crossbow at 15 and was nearly burned at the stake as a witch for it. Dohwan stood up. He held out his hand to her. She took it. He helped her to her feet and led her to the workshop. He showed her the workbench. He showed her the tools. He showed her the forges. He showed her the press. He showed her the water hammer. Sohira walked around the workshop, touching everything. She ran her hands over the walls of the presses. She turned the handle of the grinding machine. She peered into the furnace. And with every step, her face changed. The fatigue faded away. Something hot and eager took its place. She asked who had designed the press. Dohwan said he had. She asked who had come up with the division of labor. Dohwan said it wasn't an invention, but standard practice. She asked where it was standard. Dohwan didn't answer. She looked at him with a long, unblinking gaze. Then she said he was strange, that he knew things he shouldn't know, that his drawings looked as if they'd been drawn by a man from another world. Dohwan felt a chill inside. She saw. Not everything, but enough. He replied calmly that his father had studied under a good master. Sohira smiled and said that wasn't an answer. Dohwan agreed. He said it was the only answer he could give right now. Sohira was silent for a moment, then she nodded. She accepted it, not because she believed him, because the blueprints were more important than the answers. She stayed. During the first week, they worked on her crossbow together. They adjusted the spring. They recalculated the tolerances. Dohwan demonstrated how the perfect assembly worked, without calling it that. He'd just pick up a part and point out what was wrong. Sohira watched his hands and his eyes and saw that he was doing more than just looking. She didn't ask, but she remembered. By the end of the second week, they'd assembled the first prototype, a crossbow with a screw-type cocking mechanism, with a magazine for 5 bolts, with a hinged bow.
Dohwan took it out to the shooting range behind the workshop. He loaded it. He took aim. He fired. The bolt flew straight. Automatic reload. Second, third, fourth, fifth. 5 bolts in 12 seconds. A standard crossbow fires 1 bolt in 30 seconds. This one fires 5 in 12. Dohwan lowered the weapon. Sohira stood beside him, holding her breath. He turned to her and said that this changed everything. Sohira replied that she had known. She had known for 13 years. It was just that no one had listened. Dohwan said that now they were listening. That evening, they sat in the workshop poring over the blueprints, alone. The others had left. The candle was burning down. Sohira was sketching a modification to the trigger mechanism. Dohwan watched and made corrections. She corrected his corrections. He agreed, or argued. They argued for 3 hours about the tolerance on the slide, and it was the best argument of his life, in both lives, because for the first time in this world, there was a person beside him who understood, didn't take his word for it, didn't just follow his instructions, understood, on his level.
Dohwan went to bed that night and lay there for a long time with his eyes open. He thought about how Sohira could see right through him, that sooner or later she would realize he wasn't from here, and that thought frightened him more than arsonists, inspectors, and informants combined. Because arsonists can be stopped with walls, inspectors with paperwork, informants with quality. But there is no protection against a person who sees right through you. Only trust. And he didn't yet know if he trusted her that much. The 15th month was a month of growth. Dohwan hadn't planned for it to be that way. He wanted to get a foothold, to catch his breath, to get the second workshop up and running. But the world wouldn't wait. Orders came in faster than he could answer letters. The 3 barons of the southern border, 2 city councils, the Pyongan fleet, through an admiral whom Dohwan had never seen and who sent a sergeant to ask if the workshop made boarding axes. Dohwan replied that it didn't, but it could. The sergeant left with an order for 50 axes and an advance payment. Sorin was negotiating with 6 clients at the same time. Chi-young calculated non-stop.
The ledgers were multiplying. Chi-young's assistant, a boy from the temple school, was already working on his own, and she checked his work once a week instead of every day. The operation was growing. Dohwan opened a 3rd and 4th workshop in Pyonghae. Forging, assembly, alchemy, a tannery. The tannery was Ah-ra's idea. She said that soldiers needed more than just spears. They needed scabbards, bandages, arm guards, undergarments, all made of leather. And all of this is also made by I, and all of this also falls apart in 6 months. Dohwan looked at her in surprise. He asked since when she'd been thinking in terms of product lines. Ah-ra shrugged and replied that ever since she'd been sitting in a workshop where everyone around her does nothing but thinking in terms of product lines. It must be contagious. Dohwan laughed, for the first time in front of her. Ah-ra looked at him strangely. Then she turned away. The tannery opened a month later. Dohwan found an old tanner whom the guild had kicked out 10 years ago. The old man was a drinker, but his hands still remembered. Dohwan made him the master craftsman. He assigned 2 apprentices. He drew up a production plan. Within 3 weeks, the tannery was producing 30 bandages a month. Rough-hewn, but durable. Meanwhile, Sohira had refined the crossbow into a production model. The 3rd prototype passed all the tests. 500 shots without malfunctions. 5 bolts in 12 seconds. Reloading the magazine in 4 seconds. Replacing the bow in a minute. Dohwan looked at this weapon and realized it would change the course of war on this continent. A single archer with such a crossbow was worth 5 with a conventional one. A company of 50 archers could stop a cavalry charge. He didn't say it out loud, but Sohira saw it in his eyes. She said she understood. That weapons kill. That she had been thinking about this for 13 years, and that she had made up her mind. Weapons kill, but a bad weapon kills the one who holds it. A good one kills the one who attacks. That is the difference. Dohwan nodded. He thought the same. At the factory in Ulsan, he made bolts for assault rifles. Without a second thought. Here, he did think about it. But the conclusion was the same. The first batch of 20 new type crossbows was sent to Baron Yoon Sang-ho. The Baron received them. He tested them. He sent a letter, not 3 lines this time, a whole page, in which the military man explained in terse words that his scouts, in their very first battle with an orc detachment, had taken down 30 orcs in 2 minutes, without any losses, on their side. For the first time in 5 years, the Baron asked if the workshop could supply another 200 such crossbows. Dohwan read the letter and passed it to Sorin. She read it and looked at the sum the Baron was offering. Her hands stopped trembling with excitement. They trembled for a different reason. That sum was more than the annual turnover of the Black Anvil in the southern north. Dohwan said that 200 crossbows of the new type in 6 months was pushing it. Sohira said they could manage if she trained 5 more assemblers. Dohwan looked at her. She was offering to share her knowledge, to pass on her secret, her only trump card, the very thing that had kept her wandering alone for 13 years. He asked if she was sure. Sohira replied that she had read the inscription above the workshop gate, first for one, then for everyone. She said the crossbow had already proven itself on one baron. Now it was time for everyone. Dohwan nodded. Then he did something Sohee-ra hadn't expected. He took a drawing out of the folder and showed it to her. Not of a crossbow, of a water hammer, that very one, with corrections, signed in Hangul. Sohee-ra took the drawing. She looked at it, for a long time. Then she looked up. She said that wasn't his handwriting. Dohwan confirmed it. Sohee-ra asked whose it was. Dohwan said it belonged to the man who had been here before him, 30 years ago, a man from distant lands, just like him. Sohee-ra was silent. She looked at the drawing, and Dohwan could see the pieces falling into place in her mind. His impossible knowledge, his strange words, his drawings that looked unlike any other drawings in this world. She placed the drawing on the table. She looked him in the eyes. She said she wouldn't ask, that when he was ready, he would tell her himself. For now, they had 200 crossbows to assemble. Dohwan exhaled. The workshop was in full swing. The city around it was growing. Fishermen and artisans were flocking to Pyongyang because there was work here. 10,000 residents by the end of the 15th month, twice as many than a year ago. The portmaster complained there weren't enough docks, so Rin was negotiating to expand the port. Chi-yun managed the city budget alongside the workshop's accounting because the city council had asked, and Chi-yun didn't know how to say no. Han Mei opened her own laboratory next to the workshop. Not a room, a laboratory, with 4 apprentices. She was developing new formulas, an incendiary mixture for signal arrows, a water-repellent treatment for leather, lubricant for mechanisms, wood glue that held better than nails. Dohwan watched this and thought that Han Mei had become who she was always meant to be, a master, with apprentices, with a laboratory, with contracts in her own name. One evening, he stopped by to get some oil for a new machine. She was standing at the table, dictating a recipe to an apprentice, calmly, precisely, with that special look on her face that people have when they're doing what they love. She didn't notice him right away. He stood in the doorway and watched. Han Mei turned around. She saw him. She fell silent mid-sentence. The apprentice fell silent too and stared at Master Jeong. Dohwan said he needed oil for the guides. Han Mei nodded and went to the shelf. She took out a bottle. She held it out. Their fingers touched on the glass. For a second, Dohwan took the bottle and left. Han Mei stood by the shelf for another minute. Then she returned to the apprentice and continued dictating. Her voice was slightly quieter than before. In the 18th month, the black anvil struck its final blow. Not with fire, not with a denunciation, with the law. Kim Tae-gun, the guild's senior master, personally traveled to the capital and secured an audience with the king. He demanded that the Royal Craftsman's Tournament be convened, an ancient tradition. Once every 10 years, all the workshops on the continent display their finest works. The king chooses the best. The winner receives a royal contract for the entire army for 10 years. The rest have to make do with the scraps. For the past 60 years, the tournament had been a mere formality. The Black Anvil had won every time, because no one dared to field a competitor. But this time, Tae-gun demanded that the tournament be held early, 2 years ahead of schedule. The reason was obvious. The Pyongyang workshop was gaining strength. 2 more years, and it would become too big to lose. Now was the moment. Before the boy had fully matured, Seorin brought the news, and for the first time ever, Dohwan saw fear in her eyes, not for herself, for the cause. The tournament is an open field, a fair trial, but the judges are appointed by the guild. The rules are written by the guild. The evaluation criteria are written by the guild. It's a fair fight under rules written by the enemy. Dohwan listened. He was silent. Then he said one word. "Let's go." Sorian asked if he was sure. Dohwan replied that if they refused, Tae-gun would call it cowardice, that all the barons who placed orders with them would see that the workshop was afraid of an open contest. That reputation isn't a wall. You can't repair reputation with stone and mortar, only through action. Sorian nodded. She knew. She just wanted to hear it from him. The preparations took 2 months. Dohwan didn't do anything special. He didn't forge ceremonial weapons. He didn't decorate them. He didn't polish it to a mirror finish. He did what he always did.
The best spear he could make. Simple, gray, unadorned, with a small brand at the base of the tip. First for one, then for everyone. So Hira prepared a new type of crossbow, a production model, not a prototype, an ordinary working crossbow from the latest batch. Hanmei provided the best tempering oil. Ara checked every seam on the quivers and straps. Chi-Yun gathered all the documents, every blueprint, every process sheet, every quality report. A folder 2 fingers thick. Dohwan asked why. Chi-Young replied that if the judges were dishonest, the documents would remain, and anyone who wanted to know the truth would be able to read them. Dohwan looked at her, at this 19-year-old girl with an ink stain on her finger, who, at 19, understood the power of paper better than most adult men. He said she was doing a great job. Chi-Yun blushed. Then she straightened up and said she was just doing her job. The 6 of them set off for the capital. Dohwan, Sorin, Ara, Hanmei, Chi-Young, Sohira. 2 carts with samples, 4 guards on horseback. The journey took 5 days. The capital of Songryo was called Hanyang, a big city, 100,000 inhabitants, stone walls, a palace on a hill, market districts, guild courtyards, wide streets for carts. Dohwan looked at the city and calculated the width of the streets, the height of the walls, the number of smithies per square block, the gate's capacity, a habit. The tournament took place in the main square in front of the palace, artisans' tents along the perimeter, the royal tribune on the north side, the judges' table in the center, spectators on the southern steps. There was a large crowd. A tournament once every 10 years is quite an event. There were 7 workshops, 5 small ones that no one cared about, the Black Anvil and Pyokan. Everyone knew the fight would be between the latter 2. The rest were just extras. Kim Tae-gun stood by the Black Anvil's tent and looked at Dohwan across the square. An old man, 62 years old, a white beard, heavy hands, broad shoulders, once a great blacksmith, now an administrator and politician, but still dangerous. He was looking at Dohwan, and Dohwan could physically feel that gaze, like pressure. Tae-gun knew. Dohwan knew that Tae-gun knew, that the boy wasn't who he seemed to be, that someone else was inside that body, and that this other person was more dangerous than any blacksmith Tae-gun had met in his 62 years of life. The tournament began in the morning. The judges were appointed by the king on the recommendation of the guild. 3 old masters from other cities, formally neutral, in reality bound to the Black Anvil by contracts and ties. The first stage, inspection of the items. Each workshop displayed 3 items, a spear, a sword, or a crossbow, and 1 item of the master's choice. The Black Anvil displayed a ceremonial spear with gold inlay, a ceremonial sword with an engraving on the blade, and a full set of armor for a mounted knight. Glitter, gold, silk tassels. The crowd gasped. Dohwan displayed a spear, gray, simple. Sohira's crossbow, a working tool, unadorned, and a set of 10 throwing knives, identical, standard, interchangeable. The crowd fell silent. The spectacle was uneven, gold against gray iron. The judges examined them. They took notes. Dohwan stood calmly, So-rin beside him, with a folder of documents, Ara behind him, hand on her sword. Hanmei slightly behind, with a bottle of oil in his pocket. Chi-Yun on the right with an account book. Sohira on the left with a roll of blueprints. The second stage of the tournament was called the Trial of the Strike, the oldest tradition. 2 spears strike against each other. Whoever breaks, that one loses. Kim Tae-gong demanded exactly that. He wanted a spectacle. He wanted the crowd to see how the anvil's ceremonial spear would shatter the gray staff from Pyonghan. The judges announced the rules. 2 masters each choose a fighter. The fighters cross their spears. 10 strikes. Whose spear survived the most strikes, that one would win. Tae-gun chose his best apprentice, young, strong, with arms like logs. Dohwan stood up and said he wanted to change the rules. The square fell silent.
The judges frowned. Taegun narrowed his eyes. Dohwan turned toward the royal box. He spoke calmly. He said that the test of striking spear against spear shows who strikes harder, not whose spear is better. That a spear isn't made to clash against another spear. A spear is made to be held by a soldier, every day, on guard duty, in battle, on the march. And that the real test isn't a master versus an apprentice. The real test is the hands of an ordinary man. He asked permission to conduct another test, a simple one, an honest one. Let one man take both spears, one at a time, and say which one is more comfortable. Not the master, not the apprentice, not the judge. An ordinary soldier who stands guard every day and knows what a spear is better than any blacksmith. The square grew noisy. Taegun flushed. He began to object. He said that this was against the rules, that the tournament is held according to tradition, that the boy is trying to dodge a fair fight. The king in the stands raised his hand. Silence. The king was not young, gray-haired, with the heavy eyes of a man who has spent 30 years listening to other people's arguments and is tired of it. He asked Master Jeong whom he proposed as the tester. Dohwan turned around. He looked into the crowd. He found him. In the third row of spectators stood Uncle Park, an elderly guard from Pyongyang, with that very spear. Dohwan had brought him to the capital, on purpose, without saying why. Park thought he'd been taken along for protection on the journey. Dohwan beckoned him over. Park pushed his way through the crowd. He stepped out onto the square, bewildered, before the king, before the court, in front of 1,000 eyes. An old guard in a government-issued uniform with a bad back and a spear he'd been carrying for over a year without ever complaining. Dohwan told him to take both spears, one at a time, hold them, walk around with them, swing them, and say which one felt more comfortable. Simply, honestly, just as it was. Park nodded. They handed him the anvil's ceremonial spear, heavy, with gold inlay, engraved, with a silk tassel. Park took it, gripped it, assumed a stance, took a step, a second, twisted it, winced, balance on the tip, the same flaw as in all of Anvil's spears, only amplified by the weight of the gold. His lower back immediately protested. Park set the spear down. They handed him a pecan spear, gray, bare, with a small brand. Park took it, gripped it, and he straightened up, took a step, easily, a second, swung it, smoothly, quickly, like a young man. His face changed. He stood in the square before the king with the spear in his hands and smiled. The square was silent. Then Park turned toward the podium, toward the king. He bowed low and said what he was thinking. He said that he had stood guard for 30 years, that his back remembered every spear he had held, that the anvil's ceremonial spear was beautiful, but standing with it hurt. And with this gray spear, he could stand for another 30 years. The square was silent for a long time. Then, from somewhere in the back rows, someone clapped their hands. Once, then someone else, and again. Taegun stood pale. His hands were down. He wasn't looking at Park. He was looking at Dohwan. And Dohwan saw no anger in his eyes. Understanding. The old man understood. Not now. He had understood long ago that the boy from Pyongyang had outplayed him. Not with strength, not with cunning, with the truth. A simple, obvious truth that the old man knew himself, but had refused to admit for 20 years. That glitter does not replace quality. That gold on a spear does not heal a soldier's back. That a monopoly does not protect a craft. A monopoly protects a monopoly. The king stood up. The square fell silent instantly. The king descended from the podium, slowly, down the steps. He approached the table where the two spears lay. He picked up the one from Pyongyang, turned it over in his hands, put it back. Then he turned to his entourage. He said something quietly. The master of ceremonies stepped forward. He announced, "The royal coat of arms is hereby bestowed upon the Pyongyang workshop. From this day forward, Jeong Dohwan's workshop is the royal supplier of weapons and equipment for the Songryo army." The master of ceremonies removed the gold plate bearing the royal coat of arms from the black anvil tent.
He carried it across the square and placed it on the table in front of Dohwan. A small gold plate, heavier than it looked, with a coat of arms in the shape of a dragon and a hammer. A seal that meant more than any contract, more than any sum of money. Recognition. Dohwan looked at the coat of arms, then at the square, at the people. At So Rin in the front row, who stood straight, holding a folder of documents, not crying, but her eyes were wet. At Aru, her hand on the hilt of her personalized sword, standing straight, as always, but her shoulders were broader than usual. At Han Mei, who held a small flask of oil to her chest like a talisman. At Chi Yu, who was looking at the gold plate and moving her lips, counting. What exactly she was counting at that moment, Dohwan never found out. At So Hee-ra, who stood a little apart with her arms crossed and a slight smile. She wasn't surprised. She knew it would be this way, because she had calculated it. Tae-gun approached, quietly, without an entourage, alone. An old man facing a boy, 62 facing 18. The full might of the guild facing a kid with a piece of coal. Tae-gun looked at Dohwan for a long time. Then he said he knew his father, his real father, Dohwan Sr. A good master, quiet, enigmatic, with blueprints that no one could read. And that the boy he had kicked out a year and a half ago didn't know even a tenth of what the man standing before him now knew. And he asked, "Who are you?" Dohwan looked at the old man, at the man who had started all this, who had kicked him out, beaten him, branded him, and who now stood before him, not with a threat, but with a question. Dohwan answered quietly. He said he was the one who had finished his work, his father's work. The work of the master who came before his father. The work that began 30 years ago and had not been completed. Tae-gun was silent. Then he nodded, slowly, like a man who had finally stopped resisting what he had known for a long time. He turned and walked away, across the square, through the crowd, alone, a small old man without a royal crest. A year and a half had passed since the tournament. Pyongyang was unrecognizable. 90,000 residents, stone houses, paved streets. The port had doubled in size, 4 docks, a school for apprentices with 300 students, a foundry by the river, a crossbow factory, a tannery, an alchemical laboratory, a blacksmith's quarter with 12 forges, and above the gates of the main workshop, an inscription carved in stone. First for one, then for all. The Black Anvil had been dissolved by royal decree 8 months ago, not out of revenge, out of economics. The contracts were gone, the masters scattered. Some to Dohwan, some to strike out on their own, some retired. The monopoly didn't collapse from a blow, but because it became unnecessary. Like a wall that no one broke down. It simply crumbled because roads were built around it, and it became faster to take a detour. Dohwan stood on the observation deck of the new foundry and looked out over the city. Morning, early morning, smoke from the chimneys, the clang of hammers, the creak of wheels. A living city. His city, not because he built it, because he gave these people the tools so they could build it themselves. 3 years, 1,000 days, he counted, out of habit. 1,000 days ago, he woke up on a dirt floor with a brand on his arm and a hammer with a cracked handle. Today, he has a workshop that serves 5 cities and 3 kingdoms, a mercenary guard of 600 swordsmen under a flag bearing an anvil and a wheel. And people. That's what matters most. People. Princess Julia Sanrio arrived 6 months ago, formally on an inspection from the crown. In reality, sent away from court by her older brothers, whom she prevented from acting foolishly. Refined, well-educated, accustomed to everyone around her bowing. On her very first day, she came to the workshop and declared that the workshop must supply weapons exclusively to the Sanrio crown, that selling to other kingdoms weakens the throne's position, that Master Jeong must understand his responsibility to the country that bestowed his title. Dohwan listened. Then he asked what the track gauge was for the carts on the road from Hanyang to Pyongyang. The princess blinked. She said she didn't understand the question. Dohwan explained.
The track gauge on that road is 1.5 cubits. Carts from Moran are made for a 2-cubit gauge. They won't fit. This means that Moran merchants cannot bring raw materials by land, only by sea. The sea is expensive. If the workshop works only for Songrio, Moran iron will become unprofitable. Only local iron will remain. There isn't much local iron. The quality is lower. Prices will rise. The army will get fewer weapons for the same money. A monopoly. Again, the very thing they had just gotten rid of. The princess listened. Her expression changed. She opened her mouth to object. Dohwan cut her off. He said that instead of a monopoly, he was proposing a standard, a single gauge, uniform tolerances, uniform quality requirements for everyone. Songrio, Moran, anyone who wants to buy and sell. Not a ban, but rules. Not a wall, but a road. The princess fell silent. Then she laughed. For the first time in 6 months at court and on the road, she laughed. She said that Master Jeong was the first person in 10 years to interrupt her. Dohwan replied that he hadn't interrupted her. He was answering a question she hadn't asked but should have. Princess Julia stayed in Pyonghae, not at the workshop, at the city council. At first, So-rin looked at her with suspicion. 2 women, both strong, both used to giving orders, both unaccustomed to sharing space. But Julia knew how to do something So-rin didn't, talk to kings. And So-rin knew how to do something Julia didn't, manage money so it wouldn't run out. They found a balance, not right away, after a month of arguments, but they found it. So-rin handled trade, Julia handled diplomacy. Chi-yun did the accounting for both of them and quietly rejoiced that she finally had enough assistance. Dohwan came down from the observation deck and walked through the workshop. The morning shift was already at work. The clang of hammers, the hiss of quenching, the screech of grinding, voices, laughter. Someone was scolding an apprentice who had set a tip crookedly. The apprentice retorted that the master had shown him how to do it crookedly himself. Dohwan walked past. He smiled. He didn't intervene. They'd work it out. That's what the process chart on the wall was for. Ara was waiting for him at the workshop exit. She stood leaning against the wall, a sword at her belt. That very one, the personalized one, rebalanced by his own hands 3 years ago. She said a caravan had arrived from Moran, raw materials, 20 carts, and with them, a person who wanted to see the master. A woman, with blueprints. Dohwan asked what kind of woman. Ara replied that she didn't know, but the woman said she had a blueprint for a steam hammer. Dohwan stopped. A steam hammer. Not a water hammer. Steam. He looked at Ara. Ara shrugged. She said she didn't know what a steam hammer was, but she could tell from the master's face that it was something important. Dohwan walked toward the gate, quickly. His thoughts raced. A steam hammer. The next step, after the water hammer. Water is limited to the river. Steam can be generated anywhere. That means workshops aren't tied to water. That means production in any city, in any village. Anywhere there's coal and water for the boiler. He reached the gate. A woman was standing by the carts, a stranger, middle-aged, with a roll of paper. She looked at him and asked if it was true that Master Jeong was the very one who builds machines that don't exist anywhere else in the world. Dohwan replied that it was true. The woman unfolded the drawing. Dohwan looked. A steam boiler, a piston, a connecting rod, a cool, rough, with mistakes, but the idea was right. He asked how she knew about steam. The woman replied that her grandfather had told her, that her grandfather had been an apprentice to a master from distant lands, a master who had come to Marin 30 years ago and drew things that no one understood, a master named Kim Jong-ho. Dohwan stood there and looked at this woman, the granddaughter of Kim Jong-ho's apprentice, the man who had been here before him. A thread stretching across 30 years. It hadn't snapped.
It had stretched across a generation, across 2 kingdoms, all the way to the very gates of his workshop. He took the blueprint, ran it through the ideal assembly, saw the errors, saw the potential, saw the future, told her to come in, showed her the workshop, showed her the forges, showed her the water hammer. The woman looked at it all and cried, quietly. She said her grandfather had told her all her life about Master Kim, about his blueprints, about his dream to build a city where anyone could become a master. Her grandfather didn't live to see it, but the dream is here. It stands, made of stone and iron. Dohwan nodded. The dream stands. That evening, he went up to his room. He sat down at the table. 2 blueprints lay before him. An old one, Kim Jong-ho's water hammer with his corrections, and a new one, a steam hammer from the granddaughter of Kim's student. 30 years. 2 engineers from the same world. One didn't finish it. The second picked it up. And now the 3rd generation brings the blueprint for the next step to his doorstep. This world draws engineers from Korea. Why? Dohwan didn't know. Not yet. But he knew he wasn't the last. That after him there would be someone else. And that his work wasn't just machines and spears. His work is a system. One that will remain after him. Blueprints that anyone can read. Technological charts that anyone can replicate. A school that will teach. A city that will stand. Not on him. On the foundation he laid. He went downstairs. A bonfire was burning in the workshop courtyard. Evening. People were sitting around it. So Rin was checking the invoices by the light of the fire. A habit. Even on vacation, she kept counting. Ara sat on a log and was sharpening her sword with a whetstone. Slowly. Evenly. A ritual. Han Mei had settled down a little ways off with a notebook. She was writing something down. A formula, or a thought, or both. Chi-yun sat next to the assistant and explained something to him about double-entry bookkeeping. The assistant nodded and clearly didn't understand. Chi-yong explained again, patiently, just as Dohwan had once taught her. So He-ra stood by the wall and was drawing with charcoal directly on the stone, a diagram of something. Dohwan stepped closer. He looked. A mechanically driven loom. She was already thinking beyond that. Beyond weapons. Beyond war. Princess Julia sat on the steps and read a letter by torchlight. From home. Or from the palace. Her face was calm. She was no longer a princess in exile. She was a person who had found a place where her mind was needed. Dohwan sat down by the fire, between So-rin and Han Mei. So-rin moved over without looking, as usual. Han Mei moved her notebook so he would be more comfortable, also as usual. He sat and watched the fire, the people around him, at the city beyond the workshop walls, at the smoke from the chimneys, at the stars overhead. Strange stars, a strange sky, a strange world, which had become his. He thought of Taegye, of the boy who had perished in the smoke, about the guard, Park, who straightened his back for the first time in 30 years, about Kim Jong-ho, who died before finishing his work, about the woman with the blueprint for the steam hammer, about how all of this was bigger than him, bigger than a single life, bigger than a single engineer. It was a chain. Kim Jong-ho, his apprentice, the apprentice's granddaughter, Dohwan the elder, Dohwan, and those who will come after. Each takes the previous one's blueprint and finishes their own part. Each completes what their predecessor didn't have time to finish. First for one, then for everyone. So-rin looked up from the invoices. She looked at him. She asked what he was thinking about. Dohwan paused. Then he replied that he was thinking it was time to build a steam hammer. So-rin sighed. She said she knew, that he always had the next project, that he didn't know how to stop. Dohwan replied that this wasn't a project. It was work, real work, which was just beginning. So-rin shook her head, but she smiled. Dohwan looked up at the sky, at the stars above, then at his own hands, slender, calloused, with ink stains from blueprints, hands that couldn't lift a 3-pooled hammer, but that had built a city. He lowered his hands to his knees, exhaled, and for the first time in 3 years, he allowed himself to sit down. Just sit, not drawing, not calculating, not planning, just sitting by the fire, next to the people who had become his family. in the city that had become his home, in the world that had become his life. The fire crackled. The hammer on the river struck in the darkness, steadily, powerfully, every 3 seconds, like a heart. Dohwan closed his eyes. Good, now he could do real work.